All right, good morning, everyone. Super sorry for the delay, having some technical difficulties here, and hopefully we'll get that up soon as well. But it's 9:05, so we'll officially call this meeting to order. I just want to say welcome to everyone for giving up yet another Saturday. I know it's really difficult to do that, and I'm committed to still figuring out what conversations could look like to shift away from that, if that feels like what's best for us as a team. All right, so we've got just two items on our agenda today. The first one is to really dive in and think a little bit about just the financial health of the district. And to really, this is just the kind of first part of the conversation. Dr. Herndon, I'm sure will preface us a little bit with that. And then to talk through the board priority tracking sheet that Dave, Director Larson and Ms. Core has spent some time reorganizing. And then within that conversation, have a little bit of discussion about like our priorities as a whole, as a board, and how we decide what those priorities are. So it's kind of how we're going to spend our time. And like I mentioned before, and I'll say it here on the recording, we are gonna try and really be efficient in our conversation so that we can all maybe leave a little bit early today, just to give everybody back some of their Saturday. So with that, I think you're gonna start off the first part?
I'll kick us off, and then myself and Ms. Birdsong and other staff can chime in. So
Can we approve the agenda first? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Gosh, minor details. Could I'll accept a motion to approve the agenda? Thanks, Deb. All in favor? Aye. Okay, thank you.
I tried to get in quickly.
Sorry, Dr. Herndon, I didn't mean to interrupt.
You
That's
should
okay.
have.
You should have,
That's
yes.
important.
So when it comes to budget, we are facing some challenges, just like every other district, almost every other district in the state currently. For the end of this year, 22-23 school year and fiscal year, we do still project to be in the positive, which is a good thing, but not too far positive. So we will be short of what we have as a board policy for ending fund balance. Next year will be a bigger challenge. So there are some conversations that we need to have as far as what do we want to look like at the end of this year, and then also what things might look like for the end of next year. Part of this is just kind of overall budget, kind of where money comes from, where a lot of our money goes to. A big part of that goes to staffing, usually about 75 to 80% goes to staffing. The rest there's probably another 12% or so of a budget that's really it's also dedicated to things like utilities, fuel, things like that, supplies. You can cut back on some of those things like paper and things like that, but for the most part, you have to keep the heat on and the lights on and the buses rolling and things like that. So there are a couple of other expenses that are a little more intractable. So then that leaves a little bit of margin for things like curriculum adoptions and professional development. So there's some money in there. But obviously, when you start cutting back on those things, it means you're not redoing curriculum. People aren't getting the professional development. So there are places where, I've been before in budget situations where they limit a lot of those things, and then eventually they start to see the impact of that in the classroom. All of this is kind of a web that's meant to support what's the best learning environment and support for students. So that's what it really all comes down to. And when you're in a budget cutting situation, it all impacts in some way, shape, or form. So currently, when we look at that, our largest allocation of money comes from our enrollment. So in most districts, that's going to be the biggest driver of where your dollars are coming from. Like many King County school districts, our enrollment has been going down. So we will have more information on that next month when we do an enrollment plan that we'll be talking about. We're currently getting an updated 5-year projection. The district had a 5-year projection done back in, I think it was 2018, to really give a forecast of where they were thinking enrollment was going. But a lot of things have happened since then, economic changes, pandemic changes, so that's pretty out of date, so we need that to be updated. Which is one of the first steps. The other is we normally would do an enrollment projection anyway, close around this time, just kind of rolling up year over year. So that would give us a good idea about what we're looking at for enrollment. In projecting kind of what our revenue would be from that basic allocation, which again is the biggest part. We have the categorical funds, which again are partially based on how students qualify for areas like free and reduced lunch. That's a big driver of our Title I dollars, which for Tukwila is a pretty good chunk. And our ESSER funds are flowing through Title I, but they're not, there are some special parameters for ESSER that normally would apply to Title I that don't necessarily apply to ESSER. So Title I is basically the vehicle that the federal government wanted to allocate those funds through. There's still some parameters. They still have some things that ESSER and Title I cannot be spent on. But the good news for some of the expenditures in ESSER are that some of the, if you're paying for some staff, it's not going to be viewed as supplanting. So if you're using ESSER dollars, that's one of the parameters on Title I is this issue of called supplanting. So if you've been paying for something out of Title I and then you stop paying for it out of Title I, you can't pay for things before with other funds because you're supplanting what you were doing before. It's a challenging piece. So once you stop funding someone with Title I, you can't interchangeably put them in and out of Title I.
Is that like one of those things that says, well, you clearly could pay for it some other way, so now you can't go back and pay for it?
Yes, it's just one of the things you have to be careful about, that you're not supplanting using Title I dollars. Then we have high poverty LAP, learning assistance program. So there are a lot of other pots of money that we're figuring out what that's going to look like for next year as well, which all have an impact on the budget. Some of those are driven by our enrollment, the number of students that we have. And then we have things that are happening in the legislature right now that may increase the amount of funding we have also in different categories. So a couple of the big ones that I've heard about, not quite sure what the end impact will be, but one is an increase in special education funding, although from what I'm hearing, it probably will end up being a wash. We probably won't actually end up getting more special ed funding. It'll look like more in one area, but it'll be less in another. We have the possibility of increased collection for students on a per student basis out of a local levy. When they made that switch a couple of years ago, they were looking at that. So they have these different ranges, 1,500 per student, 2,500 per student, and then Seattle got a special carve out. Any district larger than 40,000 students could collect 3,000 per student. So there's a push to have all districts to be able to collect 3,000 per student. And then, yes.
And where does that where does that decision come from? Is that's the legislature?
Legislature, yeah, and then they usually put that in, it's either in the OSBI allocations or in an RCW or WAC, Washington Administrative Code, or Revised Code of Washington, one or the other. Which, and some of that's pretty ironic because one, Seattle already gets, the city of Seattle runs what's called the Family and Education Levy, which gives the school district probably an additional $40 to $50 million a year. And that alone right there, if you think about, you know, they have roughly 50,000 students, that's a pretty significant chunk of money, but that comes from the city itself. It's not an allocation from something else. And they have a very large tax base. So when they run levies, it's a small impact on.
So I'm not hearing this Fed proposals are a wash. I'm not hearing that at all. I'm hearing increases across the board.
When
it'll be probably put in over 3 years. It's not always going to be, you know, everything up front, but you know, the multiplier will increase, the safety net will increase, the payments will be on a quarterly basis rather than yearly. I mean, there's just Yeah, I'm not, where are you hearing that it's gonna be less?
When we were talking with area superintendents earlier this week, that's what we're hearing, was the ultimate payout is pretty much a wash. And Ms. Birdsong also has been meeting with area CFOs. The calculations that we're getting are that it's not going to be a substantial increase.
That doesn't make any sense to me, because we're talking about increasing the multiplier. I don't see anywhere where they're talking about reducing.
It's not, it's there, I think the latest was they actually weren't increasing the multiplier. They were just gonna increase the percentage from like 13 to 15.
Yeah, there's that.
But the multiplier is not going up. So,
That's not what I'm seeing in the current bills. I mean,
Yeah,
That's
so
it's a
there's-
dynamic thing. Things
Yeah.
are changing all the time, but
for sure. And then the other fund that we're looking at is possibly increasing transportation reimbursement. So we're hoping that that one actually comes through. That's one that's been in the works for, I don't know, a long time. That's been a problematic area for every school district as well. It's better than it was, but it's still not full reimbursement.
do we know how far we are in the hole in that, in transportation?
I can look up the number.
I
wanna
know,
say
I
it's
mean,
somewhere-
Cindy's done a really good job.
Yeah.
Not that many years ago, we like we were $500,000 in the hole, and now I thought it was like maybe 100,000.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
I can give you an exact. Well, I guess missing around there.
So those are things in the legislature that we won't know until the legislative session is over, which typically is scheduled for April. But there are times where they go longer. I'm not quite sure what that's gonna. So far, I haven't heard that they're expecting to go longer, but there have been times where they've gone as late as June, which is super late. And that has an impact, obviously, for schools because we don't know the final outcome of things like allocations that can impact your budget. So there are certainly challenges along with that. All that to say, so those are our kind of all of our inputs for revenue, which are still kind of up in the air. Our enrollment numbers, you know, that projection, we'll have more information about that later this month, and then we can report on that. But that obviously also has a pretty big impact on what we're looking at, not only just for next year, but just kind of the future and what we're kind of tracking. And then we have the elements within the school district, either in policies, practice, or collective bargaining agreements, that we also have to figure that out. So any impact on staff around either non-renewals or any adjustments to staff, we usually have those all spelled out within our collective bargaining agreements as well. So we would follow a lot of what those are. There are also some timelines associated with any of those moves. So those are coming up in the next couple of months as well. One of those adjustments that we usually, what we do is if we're going to make staffing adjustments, we look at who's retiring or resigning, and you know, we go that route with maybe not backfilling a couple of those positions. We do have that out to folks. There's a slight incentive for them to tell us ahead of time if they're coming back or not. And there's a timeline of that of March 1st. So there are a lot of different inputs that are kind of coming into us that will help better inform the actual impacts on our budget coming up. All that being said, I think where we stand, I think we do need to make some budget adjustments for next year to give us more of a cushion going into the following year, rather than just saying, well, let's just stick with what we are, even though we're going to finish in the positive. I think it's probably more prudent for us to increase that ending fund balance. Some without trying to take all of that this year, and because we just don't know what's going to happen next year. So anyway, that's kind of the global perspective on where things are. We did have a couple of questions from board members ahead of time. A lot around kind of the processes. So we can certainly go through those. But I think anything else Ms. Birdsong might want to add about kind of global picture around budgeting, we'd be happy to take any questions or start some discussion.
Is there anything you wanna,
Yeah.
yeah, go for
Yeah, like
it.
So, thank you, Dr. Hunter, for that. So it's pretty much, as he stated, the big picture, right? So just for some context, Revenue wise, about 13% of our revenue comes from, local receipts, which would be our local taxes, if students have to pay fines and fees, facility rentals, things of that nature. 23% comes from federal, revenue, and 64% comes from state. Where we find, a lot of our issues, is two things. One is, the state does not fully fund us, right? So there's part of the problem. I want to say that the compensation this year for a teacher that the state gives us is around $85,000. Our average teacher makes about 90-ish. A good majority of our staff are in that bottom right-hand corner of the salary schedule, which is approaching about 133,000. So then we have that deficit to begin with, which we would take from our local levy, which obviously is for enrichment, for the fun stuff, the exciting stuff, but we're paying for, teachers out of it. The other side of that is I kind of want to give a little bit of context, because as we can see, our fund balance over the last couple of years have went down. Parts of that is due to decline in enrollment. The state was aware that a lot of school districts were experiencing that, and for the 21-22 school year, we received an enrollment stabilization payment amount of $1.7 million on top of our ESSER dollars. And if you look at the trend, it looks like we just pretty much spent a good majority of our fund balance. We went from 4 million to about 2 million, right? So they're like, what is happening? What happened is that COVID kind of saved us a little bit. That enrollment stabilization saved us a little bit, right? Because prior, I think it was in the year that COVID happened. I want to say the first year of the implementation of the new SEIU contract was 21-22. And what we did in that SEIU contract was we looked at, with working with Mr. Dragana, we looked at what other districts in our area for those particular staff members were making, and we needed to right size how we're paying our staff, and all that comes at a cost, right? And so there's that piece, and then of course negotiations and all that wonderful stuff, and we are here. So with that being said, to piggyback off what Dr. Herndon said, yes, we need to really look at our expenses. We really need to right size, but what I think is really truly important with all of this is, what are the kids getting? What does that look like? Because what happens is we are, sometimes our thought process is, how can we help the adults, which isn't wrong, but we need to figure out, what are we providing for our students? What are the benefits? An example of that is, say, hey, we have a new social worker, we have a new counselor, we added 2 or 3. So since we added those 2 or 3, are kids happier? Are kids coming to school? Are they thriving? What does that look like? Oh, we added a new math teacher, we added 3 or 4. Are the kids doing better in math? Because I think sometimes we just give and don't understand that we need to receive. And one of the questions that the board has been asking us, which I can appreciate, because it causes me to look in the mirror and say, what am I doing? How am I contributing to the success of our students? And what are we getting in return? What is our return on investment? So with that being said, I think that is a lens, in addition to other lenses, that we need to approach when it's time to make those difficult decisions. So with that being said, is there any questions?
Another clarifier, so that enrollment stabilization money that Ms. Berton was talking about, that was a one-time allocation for 1 year.
Which I have I'm curious, a few like random lingering questions that are coming up. First, I want to just appreciate that you're centering us on that. Like, that is where we 100% should be centered. How does this all impact the kids? When Dr. Herndon, when you were talking, one of the questions I wrote down is like, how do we actually determine and decide what the actual impact is on all these things, and what it will be? So, that I would love to that be a part of this conversation or future conversations, but like, what is that question that we can keep coming back to that really does continue to center us on the students? Like, as we're having this conversation, even 6 months from now, having this conversation, always asking us, starting us with that question. How are we centering students today in this conversation? So thank you for bringing that up and making that so important. I'm curious about the enrollment stabilization, understanding that was just this 1 year, one-time thing. Is that something that has been done before in the past, or is that literally just the first time that's ever happened? Maybe not ever, but like. that you're
It's,
aware of.
as far as I know, it's the first time I can think of a one-time allocation like that, and part of that was. It was, because ESSER dollars had gone out to a lot of districts. And enrollment overall had declined so much. There were districts who were saying, hey, we didn't get any ESSER dollars, or our ESSER allocation was really low. All these other districts got these ESSER dollars, how, they can use those to help them offset kind of their enrollment loss. So there was a lot of lobbying to legislators, and that was basically how those enrollment stabilization dollars go up. I don't know what the algorithm was, but basically, if you had more ESSER dollars, you got fewer enrollment stabilization dollars.
Well, and I mean, wasn't that really the first time in recent history where we've had an across the board enrollment drop?
Yeah, across the state, yes,
Yeah.
definitely to that
Yeah.
level for sure.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah,
That was the impetus behind all that, like, those places were feeling that enrollment drop, but again, because there were federal dollars accessible to some districts, but not all. Many of the other districts that didn't receive those federal dollars basically were saying like, basically, what about us? How can we get that impact? So.
Yeah, I think there's two things. There's a basic demographic trend going on that millennials are having less kids later and so forth. So that's going on. And then also, there's just starting to be studies come out about, during COVID, there's some students that just disappeared from the system and we aren't sure where they went. But I'm just seeing that the University of Washington, Stanford is doing some studies on that, and it's a mix of student families took their students and put them in private schools. They homeschooling, and in this state, private school enrollment went up a lot. Also homeschooling went up a lot. And so all those things mixed together produce, an enrollment decline. And then in our area in particular, when you talk to some of the districts like Bellevue, for example, and you're seeing they're in the news right now. The districts that were high cost of living has just gone through the roof. Families have moved north. So if you talk to some of the districts up in Snohomish County, they're actually seeing increases in enrollment because as people are moving out of these super wealthy areas. So that's there's about 4 or 5 dynamics that are all going on at the same time. And so it's an interesting.
Same
Time to
down
be
there, down to Pierce County too, so.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah,
like Auburn has been growing, not shrinking.
yeah,
So as we have these, and Auburn's in the roadmap district, so when we have conversations about this. Alan Spiciotti, their superintendent, is kind of like, yeah, well, we're kind of growing, everyone else is
Yeah.
shrinking, but. They have different issues, and growth has its own issues associated with it, but it's on your budget, it's a lot better to be a growing district than a shrinking district.
yeah, and for us, the unique thing that I've been pointing out for a long time for us is because we used to have so many immigrant students, refugee students, and that when Trump came in, that just basically shut down. And that cost us a lot it's kind of unique to our district, but kind of look at this, there's trends at the national level, there's trends at the state level, there's trends at the regional level, there's trends at the local level. And so all of those are kind of hitting us so far in a negative way in terms of enrollment.
did we just get a coup of getting the new apartment complex? How did we do that?
Well, interesting, we were just talking about that recently, actually.
Have you all heard that?
Yeah, so we had heard that the realtor there was telling people that, they're in the Highline District, which makes sense because technically that is not in the city of Tukwila. It's on the other side of Military Road.
Yes.
Yeah, however, when you look at our maps, an old map does not show that area, but obviously we just redrew our maps to confirm all our boundaries. And if you look at the boundaries, it goes down Military Road and then the little kick out, it's
It
just
does.
that, it does. So that's actually Tukwila. Yes. So we've contacted the realtor to let them know, these are actually Tukwila students, so please. So we're going there with the enrollment information so that as families come in. Yeah, and that's like 600 units.
Yeah.
It's a lot of units.
That's amazing.
Yeah. That and as we talked about last spring, Highline discovering that they had some of our students that were in their areas. So in that same situation, I'm connecting with their superintendent, Ivan Duran, and telling him, hey, just FYI, if people are coming to you in this little complex down here, they're actually Tukwila students, so please remind
They'll
them.
be paying. For, like, they pay us then, right?
Yeah.
There's-
Yeah,
Well, I mean, that would be better, yeah, for sure. But it's also, like, that would be uprooting a student from their school that they're in, right? And so, you know, being mindful of that, but.
Yeah.
it's
Is
just-
Highline paying us for those?
for those students.
Yeah,
No, if before they were enrolling, they thought they were their students.
Right.
These right now, I don't think there's anybody in those places because it's not done. So when it's done,
Right.
that's why we're trying to get on the front end of that to say, when it's done and families are in here. As a reminder, here's all the enrollment information. You're actually Tukwila students. So we just want to make that clear. But I can understand it because it's not a Tukwila address and you would think Tukwila is all just in Tukwila. But in
Those
this
apartment
particular
things are interesting, because Bellwether is the one that just went in.
Yeah,
I thought based on the numbers that I've seen over there, we'd see some bump up and we've seen like nothing.
so this is.
So I don't know what's going on in
Yeah.
apartments that theoretically would have lots of kids in it, but don't seem to.
So this is part of the enrollment study that we'll have, because part of that enrollment information is the yield of different types of housing. So you've got single family housing, whether it's own or rent, and multifamily housing. And in the last one, the multifamily housing, the yield rate is still smaller than the single family housing, which means I think, if I recall, it's like 0.25% for multifamily housing and maybe 0.75%. It's 2 or 3 times the amount for single family. So oftentimes, and I previously, when I was in a different district and we talked about that, usually the principal of a building would say, there's a 600 apartment complex coming in, we're going to get tons of students. It's like, here's what the data is on this particular thing. This number of students times this kind of yield rate usually equals really only about 20 or 30 students, not 600. Because some people think the number of units equals 1 child per unit, and it doesn't work out that way. So this will be an update to get kind of what that yield rate is. Well, the experience I've seen in the past on that demographic has been that sometimes affordable housing ends up being young people just getting started, and then they get roommates. And so there really aren't children, they get occupied. But it's young people just kind of living together and then working sometimes in the same place or whatever that may be.
I mean, they're targeting that around the transit centers.
Right.
Especially.
Right.
But hopefully these folks have done a little bit more thinking about families.
Yeah.
coming in.
And luckily, these are, if I recall seeing the sign correctly, it's studio 1 and 2 bedrooms. 2 bedrooms are probably gonna be more family friendly. Studios, not so much.
Well, even Bellwether, my understanding, they're completely filled up, and they had some 3 bedrooms in there, but. Don't
3
seem to have
roommates.
any students, yeah, I know,
Yeah.
no students, so.
Yeah,
Those some of those folks that went into the consensus went directly from homelessness. So they could be McKinney-Vento wherever they were before
Could be.
for the rest
Mhm.
of this year.
Mm,
Who knows?
could be. But again, those,
That will then.
it's pretty soon. I think they're getting close. I don't have a target date yet, but we'll find out what that is. And it's just good to have all that information there because it's mainly gonna be probably for next year.
Yeah.
Uh,
What is the Bellwether one? I use the wrong name. What's the Bellwether one called?
That's what I call it, I don't know,
Yeah.
does that have another name?
It does. It has a name that starts with a C, but I didn't say the right word.
Yeah.
You know?
Not sure.
I guess the other question I had was, so when I was looking at, your forecast sheet, it appears to me like you're including ESSER dollars in fund balance, which I don't think is, you shouldn't do that because those dollars do not, I mean, our fund balance, I mean, you show on the revenue side, like 8.4 million in ESSER dollars, on the expenditure side, 7.4 million, so that means. You know, this fund balance is inflated by $1 million ESSER dollars, which is not really true. We can't put ESSER dollars in our fund balance.
Isn't it true for this year?
So.
No, you can't put ESSER dollars in the fund balance any year.
You can take it out, but the reason why the revenue is higher is because our indirect rates for ESSER is a lot higher than any of ours. It's anywhere between 10 and 16%. So that's why you're seeing the revenue side higher than the expenditure, because I account for all the indirects for all the grants, which happen to be higher than the expenditures. But even if I take it out, it should still be the same. But I can readjust.
Because it looks to me like, I mean, with here you got, you know, 348,000 on pending fund balance. If you lose $1 million,
But it's not
Then it goes
necessarily, it's not
underwater.
necessarily losing this revenue contingent on the expenditures.
yeah, so, but it in effect shows up in the fund balance.
I will
I know.
do an adjustment. I hear what you're saying.
I mean, the
But-
only thing that could show up in fund balance is DEA money or local levy money, really. Because everything else has to be, you know, we can't accumulate as part of a fund balance. I mean, categoricals, ESSER dollars. I don't know, local, like the tech levy dollars, I don't know if you can. If you spent less of them, could that show up in fund balance?
Well, that's a different.
Yeah, I know.
Fund, but yes, it's still.
So this is, the tech levy is
It's
completely
separate.
separate.
Yeah, but
Okay,
this is all
accounting
general,
fund.
but
Okay,
this is general fund.
I vote for spending though.
We can show that difference though. We'll kind of take if we,
my concern is that if the fund makes the fund balance quite a bit worse. Now, I don't know. I understand you're in the process of maybe shifting some dollars around so that it won't, we can actually have a fund balance that's something more than zero.
Okay.
Are we at a point where we can talk about the CBA's impact on staffing? Or is that a different later conversation?
we can start that conversation. I think eventually, you know, that certainly the collective bargaining agreements and the processes involved have an impact on kind of when some things happen and maybe what the outcomes are. But we've also looked at some of the language to change things from things like just a strict seniority kind of base. So there is some prioritization for unique skill sets. We have a couple of things like.
And that's in the CBA?
Yeah, and there are some other pieces. I can have Mr. John talk about some of the pieces, but for instance, if we have a class that we need to offer, chemistry, and the only person who can teach it is someone who has the endorsement, you have to keep that person. So if they're not, even if they're not in the seniority, if nobody else has that endorsement, we have to keep the person who has the endorsement in order to offer the class. So you'd have to look at other areas that might have an impact, which kind of gets to then the ultimate impact is that some other classes, maybe social studies or language arts, that those class sizes might go up a little bit because maybe that's where the offset is. in that.
Well, for me, it has to do with, you know, serving the students
Mhm.
and the values that we want to hold. Edna and I were at Showalter the other day, and the diversity of the staff that came to get coffee was beautiful. Now, a lot of those staff are really young. I'm just curious of how that plays in to where we go next year.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that. Yeah, I guess I could read the CBA and figure that out, but.
No, we're happy to kind of step through some of that. And that's always, I think as principals, I remember being a principal in building, like you work really hard to interview and find people that you think are going to be a really good match. And then if you get in this kind of position where you have to do some reductions and you're looking strictly at seniority, then it's just kind of like, shoot, it's hard to make progress if your new hires are the ones that also are the first ones to kind of go out. So I think we did have some language in there that hopefully helps us retain. At the same time balancing out all of the pieces that we have in there. So
Yeah, and I'd be more curious about the incentives at the other end, that you said there's some
Sure.
incentives toward retirement.
yeah, so why don't I have Mr. Dragana talk about some of those?
Sure. And I want to start by saying there's lots of ways to enter this conversation, so it's helpful if there are, specific questions or if you'd like to get.
Oh, you didn't like my general.
I just,
It's all of it's there.
but Dr. Herndon spoke earlier about just the communication we have right now with the specifically with the certificated unit, staff within the certificated unit. And what happens is we are interested in knowing in advance for March 1st, who is planning to retire, resign, or request a transfer and adjustment to their assignment. Because that helps the principals, it helps the district determine exactly what staff we're working with. And so if people do that, then we offer 2 extra days of compensation that they can pay on to plan. So there's that piece, and it does motivate people to go, okay, this will be the year that I do it. We haven't, and what we found is over the last couple of years, people tend to submit that notice toward the end of February. So right now we have just 1 retirement in and 1 resignation. What's interesting about these 2, and this happens, and that's why I think that there are lots of layers here, is one of these positions is a CTE position. And that is something, it's a unique endorsement that this person has, and it's a position that is of high interest, and we probably want to backfill that position, yeah. And then another position is an elementary classroom teacher. And depending on the numbers that we have at the elementary, we may or may not need to backfill that position. So that's what we're working with when we receive these. That's the process we go through.
Yeah, and we should mention, so when we talk about some of those positions also, I think we've talked about the K2 class size reduction that we get from the state. And maintaining that ratio is important to maximizing what we get from the state. So if you're looking at some of the reductions, like getting outside of that zone where we don't receive kind of the compensation probably wouldn't be in our best interest. So those are some of the conversations as we kind of go through this. This is where we're having these conversations with principals and departments about, okay, so let's talk about if we're looking at not bringing back some positions, what would the impact be kind of on the department, on the classroom, in the building? It's all really fascinating. Again, I've been through this process in other places, and some people say, just kept everyone in the central office. There's like, and then I've seen that happen where certain departments are pretty much gone, and then about inside the school year, the next school year, people are like, well, I don't know, I'm not getting the support, like I'm calling, nobody answers. Like, that's because nobody's there anymore. So that's always some of that challenge too. We want to be able to support like the whole process, but that's what makes it difficult. You always want to start with the classroom. That's our kind of the genesis of where everything is, and then you look at the supports that kind of emanate out from there. So,
And I would like to see us, if we can change the language so that we're not dependent on state funding to decide what we do, and say best practices say that classroom sizes need to be here, so we're doing that, not because the state mandates it, but because we think it's best for our students. I mean, for me, that's just a different philosophical language.
sure. Yeah, I mean, in this case, the allocation is not a mandate, it's an incentive.
I understand.
Yeah,
I understand.
that correlates to the funding.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's like budgeting our priorities, right? We say
Yeah.
this is what we value because we know it's gonna be what's best for our students. So how do we find the money to be able to do that?
Yeah.
But then we're still in this vicious cycle of the cogwheel of state funding.
yeah,
So I know we spent a lot of time talking about the people part of it, and I understand why, because it's a significant portion of our budget. I'm really curious to know, what are the other ways? Like, are there other expenditures that we can cut and adjust or shift or navigate before we even think about the people part? Though I know that that's a big component.
Can I just add something to the seniority list?
Sure. Yeah.
When we're talking about the seniority list, we cannot negate the positive impacts seasoned teachers have. And so I just wanted, there were a couple of comments made that it sounded like we weren't considering that, and so.
Sorry.
No, it's okay, I understand where you're coming from, but I just don't want the staff to feel that we don't value those seasoned teachers.
Thank you, Edna. Yes, it's very important.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, I think that's where we start, are the non-people places where we can kind of look at that, and that's where each building, each department looks at kind of how are we spending money within that particular department or area. And when we reduce, like, what are the things that we would reduce? And then what's the overall, as you add those up, with the areas like what's the overall impact to the budget, you know, and if we don't do this, you know, how's that impacted that? But for sure, we have lots of things to take a look at first.
I think you're talking about the, you know, the cut the central office kind of thing. So that was an issue a few years ago when we had sent, you know, administration up around 12% or whatever thing, and that got whacked pretty much back to, I think we're pretty much in line with what everybody's doing.
Right.
And so when you start cutting more than that, then then you start cutting below the bone level, and I think we've already done that.
Yeah.
I found it was interesting, the discussion about CTE is really interesting, because going back to students, CTE has funding advantages because it's smaller class sizes, you get more, but also, you know, to the student size, I mean, the CTE program has almost doubled in the last couple of years, and students want that.
Yeah.
So, you know, when we're talking about students, so yeah, if we're, you know, a staff member is CTE certified is leaving, you know, that says to me, that's a position we really want to fill, because that's what students are really interested in. And plus it has funding advantages on top of it.
Sure. There's
If a program evaluation has been done to involve student input, staff and family community to help decide on the priorities in terms of keeping what has not impacted our students.
Is that something we've done in a while? I'm not aware of that happening, at least in the last
Yeah,
year.
not to that kind of extent. Yep. But definitely something that.
I mean, that to me feels really critical,
Mhm.
right, to this point. I think going back to, you know, one of the first things that Ms. Birdsong said. And, you know, I really want to go back to that too, as well, this idea, and you said, if we hire a counselor, what is the impact that counselor is having, right? Are we seeing the benefits? Whatever that benefits might be, right, for our students. But like, yeah, where's that analysis? Because I don't think, then we're just making, if we're sitting up here without that information, then we're just making a bunch of assumptions about what we think is working, what's not working, rather than like really hearing from. So for me, I think that feels like the most natural place to start.
There are a couple of other things that we'll want to shed some light on as well. So over the last several years, we have tried to relieve some of the pressure on basic education, the general fund. So part of that is expanding CTE because it comes in a different fund, which is helpful. It's enhanced funding that happens with that. The other is when we ran our last capital levy in almost 4 years ago, 3 years ago, we shifted allowable expenses into the capital levy that had been coming out of the general fund. So that shifted a significant amount of money annually to go into that. We tripled that capital levy the last time we went out to allow for that to relieve some pressure, which has certainly helped over the last couple of years. And we could continue to do. But the capital levies also have a set of parameters that you can and can't use to shift funding into there. So we always want to make sure that we're doing that. So a couple of those moves have helped us out in the long run. But absolutely, when we're looking at program and class offerings, that's a big one. The other one would be, and we've had some conversation about this when we've heard from some students about what's offered in the schools. If we continue to see the high number of students doing running start, sometimes because those classes aren't available, we don't get the funding for those students when they go to running start. So if we can have those students back at the high school because they're seeing the classes that they feel challenged in and are rigorous, at least even moving from full-time to half-time, all of that helps us as well. And I think that's part of a program review when we're hearing from students, and we've heard from some students lately.
I think too goes back a little bit to that, this idea of return on investment too, of like, what are we really expecting to some degree, for lack of a better word, that are the folks within our districts, right? That they're, what are we expecting them to give because of what we are giving them, right? Or what, yeah.
Yeah, the challenge about going out to the community and parents and asking, what they want is, what I've seen is there's a fair amount of education process that needs to go on about how the current system is working. And that conversation I've always seen is really, I mean, we've had over the years the budget advisory that community members come in and it just, that acronyms start flowing and, parents just kind of tune out because they don't understand what's going on. And so there's a challenge that, I think it can be, you can do it, but we have to recognize that it requires some real effort to kind of be able to talk about system, not in the, jargon and acronyms, but in a way that's comprehensible to them. So that's, we just need to recognize the challenge, and typically that's going to be a load on our staff to do that. And we just need to recognize that, it can be, I'm personally, I'm all for, I love, student voice, community voice, all that kind of stuff. It's all helpful. I'm not sure we're that far off. It can be really good to get that, but we just have to recognize that it's going to require some intentional investment in staff time to make that happen well, I think.
And one of the things that we have to be mindful of is if we do this to the staff, to the community, to the students, the backlash will absolutely happen without involving their input. Not to say that, well, and we need to make sure that we position this as this is input and recommendations, and we will take this back. And then, think about the overall impact of the input that we receive. But I think it's important that we involve everyone that is going to be impacted in the process. So, and to your point, we have to make sure that everyone understands the what, the why, the how, and the final outcome.
I think sometimes though we ask people to get into the micro level. And I think sometimes what we want from the community is macro, it's the bigger vision, all of that, and then it's our job or admin's job to figure out what the micro is on that.
So I guess I would say from that, in 2009, when school districts were doing their big cuts, as a parent, I sat on what we call what our school district has called the financial impact advisory team. 30 people representing all sorts of different groups, and this whoever the person that had finance at that time gave like all the big picture, like these are the buckets of how you get funding. And I remember like partway through thinking, oh, we're too much in the weeds, but when it came down to the point of the finance department coming back with like, based on the big picture feedback we got, we hear the areas in which we are going to present to the school board areas for cuts, the ripple impact in terms of people being like, oh, at least I was part of the process. I was really surprised at how good people felt leading that committee, because all we did while we were there was decide things we weren't going to pay for, like make recommendations for things we weren't going to pay for. Like we weren't going there to be like, what is the new school we're building gonna look like? What kind of paint, rethinking, and carpet? We were all going there like, we have to make some cuts. What are the things we're cutting? But it was a long process. I remember it started like in the winter and it went all the way through the spring, and it was a significant time commitment. But I thought that the school district personnel ran it, were like super well prepared and were able to pull, like we heard you talk about this last time, so we're presenting this information to you this time. To such that when they got to the point where they had to make recommendations for significant cuts, the people in the room weren't like ready
Yeah,
to go
that-
after each other's throats or anything like that. So I would just say, having been a part of something like that, I remember it being good.
The other-
Super long and
Yeah, the other challenge for us is, and I've talked to other people in other districts that have been on these committees, like district citizens, and it really requires what I would call a critical mass of parents and community, because if you're just one or two, you get really, everybody gets really intimidated by that. And so we've had trouble just being able to get that many folks in our community to do that. So that's another thing that we need to figure out. How do we, and then maybe the parent advisory
Can be
group
helpful for sure.
is the most number of people that I've seen in, try and do that, but because we need to get enough of them that they feel, confident enough that,
Maybe they can help us go to the mosque and we facilitate our meetings there.
Yes.
Maybe they
Yeah.
can help us go to whatever they know
Sure,
there will be
yeah,
a critical mass. We can go there
Right.
to facilitate the meetings.
Right.
Instead of us having it here
Right.
and then say, come to us.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think if we're starting that process now, to Dr. Dino's point, the helpful thing is that this can continue to evolve over 8 months. So even though that process felt long from winter to spring, if we're talking now ahead of next year's bigger issues, at least laying a lot of that foundation in this spring, summer, fall, we've got a lot of that conversation, discussion, and community knowledge about it going into the even more critical budget decisions for next year. So I think that will help, and bringing in students who are like not seniors, so students who are going to be impacted by that over the coming years will be helpful as well.
the other thing I've thrown into this is, I've been playing with this kind of new AI technology, text analytics, and what the nice thing about it is it allows people to, asynchronous, in other words, whenever they feel like it, and to put in their feelings about, various subjects related to school district. And then the problem in the past is a lot of times when you get a lot of text, then you need somebody to analyze all that stuff and figure out what it is, and they have their biases and blah, blah, blah. But there's technology out there that can kind of take all that mass of text and make some sense out of it. So I'm thinking that's and also you can do that in multiple languages, because that's the other challenge we have, is we did a lot of, over 50% of our parents, native English is not their first language. So how do we get their input into this process? And so, we need to figure out ways to let them express in their language, into this. So anyway, there's a variety of things I think that we could utilize.
Knowing all those things that we need to keep at the forefront. That committee needs to then, okay, we need interpreters, we need all of the things that we need. We just need to make sure that we are aware of that and have that and not let that deter us from the work that needs to be done. Because I promise you on the back end, to cut anything without community input, staff input, parent input will not be a good feeling.
And I-
Mhm.
That wouldn't feel good to me, not even a little bit, yeah, and I probably wouldn't vote on it. Y'all see it, I'll be like, no, take it back.
So, but there needs to be that,
Yeah.
intentional thinking about how do we go about doing it?
Yep.
What have we tried in the past that didn't work very well? What can we try different this time that hopefully will work? And so, I'm all for all that stuff, but we just need to be pretty intentional and have a task on a list and somebody's gonna go do that stuff, so.
This is also critical because right when this, basically a year from now is when our ballot measure for the next levies are out. So having this conversation, knowing where that's going to be is important to lay that groundwork. So I think that whenever we schedule our next conversation about this budget, we can develop, we'll start working on timeline basically from next year's budget adoption backwards. To then give kind of that bigger picture frame about timeline about where things are gonna fall and other significant financial instances happening, which also things like when we get our allocations from the state, kind of when, if there are any new impacts for allocations from the federal government, if they have anything that's coming out, then we can just kind of put those into the timeline so people have an idea about. So when do we get this? Okay, so then this is critical information that we need to know at this time. So I think that would be helpful too in our process. As we include whoever else along, I'm just thinking about tools that we can help as we explain the process and get people involved, so they have an idea about kind of time frame, time commitment. When we're talking about trying to get people in there, it's like people will want to know how frequently, how much time are you asking me to input, when our decision's going to be made, so that I'll know what to expect as we come to giving recommendations and input along the way.
Yeah, I think what could be valuable too within that, and it's likely that it'll be built in, is like from a community's perspective, where are there different opportunities for them to kind of plug in? I think flexibility within that too is great. So if you've got someone that maybe can't commit to like being on a full, 8-month committee
Right.
that's really thinking about this, there should be built-in ways for them to still feel like their input can be heard and valued, and that they are an equally valued part of the process.
Yeah, we definitely need to expand from the way we've traditionally done these input processes. There need to be more avenues. So I'm kind of excited about this text analytics thing, because you can open it up to anybody, anytime. Because we know, traditionally we've done, okay, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock after we're, and not everybody can do that time. And so to have a mechanism that's flexible, whenever you have some time, give us some input on it, and then make it really flexible, and then, but also then have a feedback loop that, we really heard you, otherwise, obviously, if there's no feedback loop, then, people, well, they're just running through the air and nothing happened.
No, which is one of the things, as you're aware, even with the budget advisory committee, it's frustrating when the committee is literally the people you see every day, that you work with, that you're already having those conversations with and working with, right? You reach out, you try to do your best to get students, parents involved, and then like maybe the first 2 meetings, it's like, any questions from the parents, or they're not on the screen, so you don't know what they're doing, any questions, and then it's like nothing. And to Director Larson's point, which was a great reminder, because when I was having a budget meeting with Dr. Borche, she's like, excuse me, Ms. Birdsong, you're speaking budget language. I'm like, oh yeah, that's so great. And taking that and saying, because in my mind, I'm programming numbers, acronyms, and she's like, back up a little bit. But to Dr. Larson's point, really getting it on that surface level and really breaking it down so it's semi-relatable. You're doing charts, you're doing things that, people who may not come have that experience in the budget world, they would say, oh, okay, that totally makes sense, but it gets a little frustrating and boring when, again, it's my regular team that I'm working with, because I feel like we're doing half of the work, right? Like we're not really including everybody, even though, you try. So, yeah.
If we can develop that, the closest thing I've seen to expand is this parent advisory group, if we can kind of leverage them and expand it. That's the thing and then whatever other ideas we can think of, but that's the one that seems to have the most grab to it.
I think we're getting also, we're trying to include more student voice in what we're
definitely
doing,
student
which
voice.
is helpful, and
Yeah.
hopefully by getting students excited about it, they talk to their adults at home or other people too, and so that's, we're hoping to just hit lots of different areas to kind of get that word out as much as we can.
But I guess I wonder too, in terms of like the teaching aspect of what all the different things mean. We have a lot of different social media avenues. I'm not taking some of the statements, and I don't do so lot of social media, so I'm trying to get this wrong, but like, if we had like budget minute Monday or something, where there was a 1 minute, if you look at videos that like 7 minutes long, like some short video where you're explaining some snippet. And that you're posting with whatever your frequency, whether it's once a week or once every other week or something.
You know, that's actually a good
That's
idea,
a
and working with the
great
kids at the high school.
idea.
And then it becomes like, okay, your speech is gonna be
Yeah.
maybe larger to people when they look, or.
Yeah.
I guess
That's a
I,
good idea.
I think making so
because there's so
digestible
many
in that
things that
way.
are videos now, like
Yeah.
before people would like click and read a link, but now maybe they're just clicking and watching the video instead, like, do we wanna take advantage?
Yes.
And the short-
And I don't know how to make that happen, but this.
I think that could be a good idea. The challenge is to, what I think is always, we need to, first of all, figure out what the students are interested in. And so, for example, we're talking about going up to the civics class, and whenever I've gone up to classes at the high school and you start getting the students talking, you can immediately find out pretty quickly what they're interested in. And those are the topics then you could develop into
And I
something.
guess I'm thinking like, you know what the different acronyms are, you know what the.
Right, kind of working on, I'm pretty sure we have what a videography.
Like here's the like budget 101, so we have a course of like 15 videos, what are the things you wanna hit?
Mhm.
And then if you get questions, what are the response? I don't know.
And I think also, to kind of what Dr. Forte is, you know, taking it to them, for example, like when I was getting the ESSER input, right? Like I went to the different student groups and said, hey, and you know, they were still like, you know, whatever. Someone's like, yeah. But you know, actually taking pieces of that to them instead of come to us.
I thought she got some
Yes.
good input out of that.
Yeah, that was actually pretty good.
Yeah. So that was another good.
I think we also, my culture works linearly. And many cultures work circularly. So when we put something in a linear fashion, I think some people disconnect. Because if you miss one of those pieces, you're not ready for the next piece. How do we just think about the different cultural ways of making decisions? And always have that in our minds. I don't know, I work hard on that.
Excuse me, so specifically to like, for example, the budget advisory committee. I always go back to the beginning. Every time we start, we always go back to the beginning and say, hey, let's do a recap. Any questions? And then we move on to the next, to the next topic. So what, at any point, whenever somebody comes in, they're caught up within, you know, the first 30-ish minutes. But yeah, that is a good point.
Doing things in a circular motion when with like a timeline component too. Cause like there is a.
And yet there is, it's always
True.
evolving.
No, you're fine.
Well, I think that actually kind of brings me to one of I think the most important thing that I want to understand from today is like, what do you all need? What do you need to feel supported? Because I mean, I think to your point, like, if it's not gonna feel good to you to continue to like host those meetings that are just you and your team that you're speaking to, talking about this, you know, how can we support, right? In getting more, you know, people there. That idea is amazing. And I think I totally think we should tap into that for so many reasons. Like, and those are those types of the creative things. I'm like, let's do more of those. Because I think it'll just so like, what is it that we can do, whether it's right now or, you know, kind of in the next little bit of time that can really kind of support you all.
Students how they. Have we asked students what can we do to bring that information to them? So that the students probably would have better insight than I would.
I think the biggest thing that I've heard, like mostly from Dennis, is when things come from students are going to be more receptive. So that's why another reason why I think that video is such a great, powerful idea. Not only is it short snippets, but if it's going to be the students presenting this information to the students, it's going to be much more received. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question to keep asking.
I don't know, the student thing is always, like you said, to go to where they are, so, and that's what you did, and that's what works. I mean, when we go to the civics class, I mean, that's what, you just go to where they are, whether it's in their clubs or in their classrooms or wherever. that's where you go to collect the information.
Yeah, I think that's kind of, yeah. at that
And
point.
the challenge that would, and we've kind of, the thing that we haven't really figured out, I think, right, is how to do that with community. To go into the community, that's one we haven't really.
Because that's what I was thinking of, is the informational things to be available to community members. So I like the idea of having it done by students, you know, hey, mom and dad, I made this video, watch it, share.
I mean, I think the closest we've gotten to that is when the liaisons get their community things, and I don't know, the last one I did was a strategic plan. But it was, we gave them a kind of list of things to rank, and so. I mean, there needs to be, when I've seen that done in the past, what's more interesting, I think, is. When you just open it up, you know, what do you think about our schools? And when you get the liaisons, which are more trusted in those communities, because they understand the culture, they understand the language. And you start getting them talking, that's when you get interesting stuff that starts coming out. So that's what we've done, I think, in the past, that has worked pretty well, and so we need to leverage more of the liaisons, I think.
And we create phases of this work as Super One Voice. And so whenever we are asked, we know that we're in this phase and this is our one voice response to staff, parents, or whomever asks, just have one voice. And just staying on the same page, because we'll get different questions throughout. And we just need to respond with one voice and not our own. This is the way I want to do it, is one voice, just starting from there. And then create the phases of our work.
I think that's beautiful. So if we were to say the phase that we are in now, we are in the planning phase. So if someone were to come and ask me something, I'd say, well, right now we're in the planning phase. The team is figuring out what our timeline, our plan, what the other phases are gonna look like. More information to come, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
We can organize that. As we look at the timeline, we can break that down into phases for sure.
Just a thought. With CTE open house coming up, wouldn't that be a perfect time to talk to parents and students about what it is about that program that benefits them?
yeah.
Well, and to build off of that, I think many of us sit with community, to your point. And just in many different settings, so I'm thinking of, the city's Equity and Social Justice Commission, we've got lots of community coming to that commission, we've got TCF, Tacoma Children's Foundation. And I'm wondering if it's, and then events like, or programs like, what is it, the CTE advisory group. Just being intentional about that time that we, have with those groups and.
Or even games after school sports, there's
Yeah.
a turnout.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then, kind of lining that up with this phase plan that you would suggest.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of leveraging stuff that already
Yeah,
exists,
yeah,
because we
right.
know our community is taxed. I mean, people don't have a lot of extra time lying around, so. The degree we can leverage stuff, whether it's PTA, whether it's, Black Student Union, and all these things exist.
Mhm.
If we can just plug into them, yeah.
And so part of our phase, part of our work will be identifying all of the existing community events or groups.
Because a lot of them, depending on, for the most part, where they're at, the work that we do in the school district directly relates to them, right? So people with the Tacoma Children's Foundation, they probably own homes, so
Yeah.
their money, what does their money look like?
And they're
In the
very
district.
curious, what's happening in Tuckahoe, how can they support it?
Just even having a poster board where they can stick suggestions, of
Mhm.
what they like about things. It doesn't have to be a dialogue, they just have a minute to write something down. We can share a thought.
You can see it also as opportunities to get, other community members on board, right? So like if I'm at this meeting and I hear something about what's happening in the Tupelo School District, great, I might go take that information and go be a steward of it somewhere else. So really leveraging the folks that live in the community to then become advocates for the work that we're doing.
So are we considering this informational? For us to tell folks what's going on, or information gathering? How do we make that a philosophy? For that I don't know.
To me, it's both. Always both.
Yeah.
It's a
Different times,
dialogue.
different, we'll have different.
But I think it
emphasis.
often comes across as we're telling.
Right.
Um,
But that may get to kind of the different phases in the responses and voice that you kind of have along that, depending on where the phase is. So again, planning phase right now, we're just letting you know this is what's happening. Then when we're in the next phase, like this is what we have. We actually want to hear what you have to say.
And I think the education piece is important too, because sometimes you hear the narrative, oh, the money, the district is doing X, Y, Z, but they don't have the context of why the district may be doing X, Y, Z. Sometimes our hands are tied here, so this is what it looks like. So I think it comes back to just the fundamental of education of how things work in the school district. You know, we're not trying to cut programs, or we don't like having programs, but sometimes depending on where we are, that's what it looks like. So just having that education and then letting them be a part of that, so that again, that narrative has now shifted to say, oh, that makes sense. Again, it's kind of like the why, the how, and the who.
And almost every program, every class has a champion for the
Right.
success of that.
Yeah.
So in a reduction, you're always gonna hear at least one voice say, don't cut this, please don't reduce that.
Right.
And again, it's not that we realize, like, there's always going to be some successes in the programs, but we're trying to also look at the bigger picture and look at how, kind of, how many people are being impacted. It's tough.
Yeah,
It's
because I
really
get into this,
tough.
this tricky of like, you've got 50 students that are impacted positively by this program, but maybe they're all, you know, middle income white students, right? And so how are we looking at the different groups as well, and making sure that we're not over prioritizing just because we hear 50 voices and the benefit, and maybe this one program serves 5, you know, Black or brown students so well. I want to make sure that we are, you know, leveraging that and lifting that one up rather than, you know. There's 2 other things I feel like I want to just say, get up first. So we talk about CTE. Love that. I love the fact that like we want to leverage the fact that it's beneficial for our programs. I also, or for our students, I also want to make sure that that is very high school focused or secondary focused. So making sure that we're also thinking about what is it that our elementary students are really latching onto, and how can we really, you know, build in more there as well. So I want to just make sure that as we're thinking holistically about the budget, it doesn't, because it could be easy probably to think more about secondary. So I just want to name that. And I think the other thing is, yesterday we had a really great meeting with some folks from the PSESD board. And one of the things that they're going to support us in doing is really thinking about what a strong board and community engagement campaign would look like. And I feel this thing working really well in alignment with what we're trying to do here. And then going back to what you were talking about, like, it shouldn't be about us telling the community what we're about to do. I mean, I think we can certainly make these plans, hear what the phases are going to look like, but actually how we implement those phases, I think will be really important to get community voice. Dr. Bourchier, you mentioned going to the mosque. You know, I think it would be great to maybe even gather, not only know what events are taking place in our community, but gather some of those key stakeholders and say, what is going to be the best for us to bring this information to you? So it's not just assuming, so we don't just go and take over their community spaces, but it's done with thought. And again, really co-creating what that community engagement is going to look like with those communities that we want to engage.
Yeah, I guess when you're talking about the CTE, I immediately was thinking in the lower levels. So one of the things that I'm working on is trying to connect the robotics programs going on in the elementary schools. Go and I mean, I know that's what's going on at the high school, and they're doing a competition in about May or so. They'll have a really neat robot. So let's bring the kids up to see what that really neat robot is.
Strengthening those
Yeah.
connections between.
Yeah,
already
no,
happening in
Yeah, I mean,
elementary
that's something
to-
we have
Yeah,
kind of observed in
for
this district
sure.
forever is we have this silo building thing. We need to establish those connections
Yeah.
all up and down the line, because you get kids in 5th grade excited about a CTE program in high school, and now I know where I want to go or something, you know, so yeah.
Potentially do with just in general, if we're just talking about that program, let's just say robotics, having that something like big brother, big sister, right? You adopt a elementary student, right? Like, oh, well, I'm gonna adopt Bobby because, we both like robotics. And once a week, you're at, how are things going? Or you connect or something, along those lines, just so that kids can aspire, right? Because when they, like, just like a big brother, big sister, I guess if you like a big brother, big sister, you look at them and you aspire to, be like them. And so, we could probably.
And you're building in so many other things like
Yes.
mentorship and skill building and cooperative. What, like,
Yeah.
so many like social emotional learning things that you're building into just that model like that.
I think that's great.
Sorry, I didn't mean to-
You see it right here.
I was just like, ooh, I love that.
When we're ready to circle back, I want to circle back to how do we gather information on the things we put in place, especially the counselors. And I mean, Ed and I've been talking to people and I've been asking principals and faculty, are your kids better off with all of this? And the response I usually get is, we don't know, but I know that this isn't working. So it's always that something else needs to be emphasized. And how do we collect that? I mean, I've got a whole bunch of conversations in my head that really have no place to go. I mean, maybe it's just connecting.
I think we also heard all the additions that we've made have been very helpful.
Yeah.
And that I got the feeling that the students are doing better, but the staff is struggling,
Yeah,
and that concerns me.
right.
And the other piece too, is, and Dr. Portia, we've talked about this, is we feel like this is better, right? But what, we need something outside of feelings. That feelings are great, but they're also, personalized and they're relative to the person. So how do we measure that thing? How do we measure it and say, what, it feels good, but in addition to it feeling good, we see the impact here. And even the feel good piece of it could literally be from the student, but taking that step and actually talking to the student and say, well, hey, now that you have more time with this particular person, how are things working for you? Oh, well, I like going to school now and I'm doing
Yeah.
better, or I sleep a little bit better
Yeah.
versus just, I think and I feel, just kind of that extra step. But again, it's like, how do you measure those things and what does that template look like?
So one of the things I'm looking at, the mood meter sitting out there, that's something we're collecting, I think. I don't know that anybody's collected in one place, but I was thinking about connecting that with academics, for example. How do students feel about mathematics? How do students feel about their different subjects? And are they, in terms of pleasant? I mean, that's a way we could start. I mean, if you start measuring how they're feeling about things, feelings, if you have when I was motivation is kind of half the battle in education. And so if students are feeling better about something, I think that's a notable improvement, because you will see then, I think, the improvement in the academics as well.
And that's the other side of it versus just the adult saying, I feel like you're doing better, right? Going that next step.
Right,
Actually getting it from the
right,
student versus the
right.
adult, not that the adults don't matter,
Right.
but.
So how do we put together a plan together? Something.
So when I did the 5-year CTE plan, normally I do surveys and they would just select like a number, but when you get the narratives from kids, I mean, that really, like, I added like 10 things to the plan after I heard about the narratives that they were telling me. And that was very positive. It takes a little more time, to crunch it and look through it and kind of read the themes and pick the themes up. But the narrative is just like
That makes me
really valuable. I mean,
Yeah, that's the thing, data stories action, which I call it, and we need to figure out how to meld that all together. And again, I can go back to my AI thing. If you get a bunch of stories out of people, and then how do we figure out, and can we use our CE survey things to try and get stories out of people?
One of the math resources that we are piloting does just that. Ask students at the very beginning, how do you feel about math?
Mhm.
Even from the lower grades on up, you can respond by circling a face. A sad face all the way up to a happy face, I'm not sure.
Mhm.
And then after a few lessons, then it asks you again.
Mhm.
Now it wants you to write about it.
Mhm.
So that is part of one of the math resources that we are piloting.
Yeah, and so then the
And it's
question
the
becomes,
grades.
yeah, then the question becomes, how do we go about analyzing that information? And there's multiple ways to do it. You know, one of the ways is just individually kind of go through it, but there's also some automated ways that I think would be really interesting to look at.
Yeah,
kind of that
it's
stuff.
like a mood meter over time, and we could
Yeah.
invest in the time in creating a Google form. That's a mood meter capture. And then when the student goes in, doesn't matter what grade, they can pick where they're at, and then the form will cap it. There's ways technologically you can make it even easy for kindergartners, just like they're circling on a page. Like push the piece, someone has to like, obviously do the coding in that part of it, but then you can, to your point, look, we do this on Mondays and Fridays.
I think one thing that just gives me a little bit of pause around using the mood meter specifically is when we think about. Well, first off, there's no feelings attached to that, right? It's just, there's no feeling words
Not
attached
in
to
this
that,
one.
right?
Some of
Some,
them.
some there are,
Yeah.
for sure, if you attach them, right? But if you know, I think it could become easy to then be, put our own thoughts around what feelings are good and bad, right? We added, yeah, adding, okay, that's a, yeah, that's a great version. So yeah, adding value to one or the other, and just because a young person might feel in the red on a given day, that's okay. And it's more about like how we recognize where we are at any given moment and then move through that. And then if we want to move towards the blue or whatever, like we have the tools in which to do that. So that's just one thing I just want to be mindful of, like not using the mood meter for something that's not particularly specifically intended to be used for.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'm a student. And I'm feeling in the red about my math today. But my teacher helps me. And now I can say I'm in the green because of all the support that I receive from my teacher or my peers. Wouldn't that be a way that we can teach students to be able to apply and synthesize everything in your room to your learning?
I think it could be. I think I think my initial thing is like, is that teacher first asking them, how do you feel about being in the red today? Do you want to help? Like, do we need to shift it a little bit to the green, or are you okay being where you are? So I think a little bit, it's like the analysis about one's own feelings and one's desire to shift their feeling or not about a particular thing. That I think then gives a young person ownership of the feeling. So yes, I think ideally that's what it's all about, right? Again, skills, tools that'll help young people recognize and then move through things. But I think it's just more how we're using it. Are we asking them the question first?
And I think to the longitudinal benefit, for example, is if in a classroom, let's say we have 2 second grade classrooms, in a classroom at the beginning of every unit, you have 60% of the kids who are in the green at the beginning of every unit, and then in the other classroom, you have 60% of the kids who are always in the beginning red at the beginning of that unit. But that's a place where teachers could share amongst themselves, like, oh, what do you think the differences are? What do you talk about? And the teacher in the green says, oh, I always do something, and then kids are doing whatever. So it's not telling the kid that they're wrong, or even that the feeling isn't okay, but if you see, I'm not saying you would, but if you see some trends over time, it's another place for self-reflection for the teacher and then for us, the system, like, oh, we noticed that unit 3 in 3rd grade, this new math curriculum, like all the kids were red at the end of unit 3 across the district. Like, what do we need to look at and it's happening in that unit that's having this type of impact?
Be great.
Like, I think there are ways to bring it way, I know it's satellite, but way up.
So to bring it all the way up,
Yeah.
back to budget. I think it's just one data point that we can look at to help inform us about prioritizing what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tool like anything else, not the only thing. You did say that there weren't words, there are.
Yes.
Yeah, it depends.
It depends on the movie.
Yeah,
The
and-
movie itself does not have words, but people have made
Yeah,
really great
Yeah,
versions of it. for
And-
sure. Yeah.
and the words are interesting because it can inform, like, if you're in red, are you frustrated or are you, concerned? Those are two different things which have different instructional implications. If you're frustrated, that means you're trying something, it's not getting there, and you just need some,
Bring it back up.
yeah.
Bring it back up. It's like-
I also look at that, like, how much are we expecting young people to separate the feeling that they might be feeling just in general than the feeling they might be feeling about this particular subject, right? So if I come in and I've had a really crappy morning, my sibling is yelling at me, my mom is yelling at me, or running behind, all these things were happening. And so I'm really frustrated going into this day of math. So of course, I'm gonna put myself in the mood meter. So then, in that way, so just like, how do we disconnect, like, what the feeling is about the subject from just the feeling that that young person might be experiencing? Last thing, idea, pulse checks. Is that, so I've used it when I've been a part of another organization, they did it for staff, like weekly pulse checks, which was just like a single tiny pulse, I think is the company we used to do that. But just single questions once a week. It was like, it was kind of a temperature check. How are you feeling around this particular thing? Or it's a really targeted question. You put her here and there's a chance to do like some narrative if you wanted to, but you didn't have to. I think that could be a really unique way, because even though I love like even with like the math curriculum you were talking about, there's like kind of beginning, how are you feeling about math, and probably an end, how are you feeling about math. There's so much time in between those two checkpoints that I think we could have the opportunity, if we had some consistent pulse checks of some kind, and not necessarily just about math, but so that could be an option as
We had a
well.
pulse check yesterday to show off. Staff were all tired, absolutely exhausted. And they were really having trouble thinking about getting through one more day.
Mm.
From what?
And also, I noticed that several of them questions of things that they hadn't heard the answers to from the board and stuff. One was SROs. They haven't had a person tell them exactly what's going on. And that was very frustrating to some of the children staff.
Yeah.
So if we're gonna make sure that we carry through with things. With information.
For sure. I mean, I think, not to get on much, Dr. Herndon gives us a good amount of information in those memos, as a way for us to be armed with that information and share, that's not a good word to use, but to share with community. So I think utilizing those, and also of course continuing to, I know particularly the SRO has been a really ongoing discussion. So, directing folks back. It's not always, I don't think we can always close the loop. Sometimes it's about directing them to other folks to do that. So I want to just speaking of pulse check, do a quick check-in. It's 10:32. For the budget conversation, how are folks feeling about where we are? I think we have a few identified next steps, which feels really good to me. And felt like a really rich dialogue.
I think what may describe as evolve into these conversations, I think it tells us where we are really. And
Can you tell me where we are?
we are at the mood meter, at the checking the pulse, at the, all of that across our district. And maybe not at the crunching the numbers place, or I don't know. How do we pay attention to that? That's, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I'm not actually sure where exactly we are at the numbers. I know that's something you're still, and it's also dynamic as it moves from time to day, week to week. But it's some way the numbers are important because eventually you get down to the point you want to do stuff.
Well, trust me, the numbers are really important.
Yeah.
There's nothing there to do it with, so.
And that's, as you remember, that's a big
Yeah.
deal, so things have
Yeah,
changed.
yeah,
You
yeah.
got a portion of it, and you got all kinds of things that happen, adjusted and shifted, so it's gonna look different.
We have notes from today that we can reflect back some items in there and develop some phases, timelines. And just reflect back on other aspects of what we've had. So, yeah, I mean, believe me, it's easy to go down off of different things because there's so many things that people would like to talk about. That stem from one thing to the next. And the hard part is taking all that in while also staying the course on a couple things that have to be done because of a timeline, not because of our own timeline, but because of what we know we have to do with the state. And we just want to be prepared for that. So part of that is, it is good to hear all those things. And we've got a lot of good information about, ways in which we can continue to hear feedback from whether it be staff or community or students that help inform us along the way. So they're all good things.
And when things get this low, our fiduciary responsibility to the money aspects of this district in terms of its bond ratings for future and everything. I get really concerned when things get this low. This is too low for my comfort level.
Yeah.
For sure, and I know it's.
Yeah.
For everybody, yeah, I mean, that's everybody's every district is in this, all their fund balances are getting drawn down. They all have policies about the level of fund balance, so it is a shared concern for sure.
And the other piece of it too, is that there's some districts out there that are in trouble,
Yeah.
right? Meaning that
They're in the red this
other
year.
people are gonna have to step in
Yep.
and start making the decision
Right.
for them, so it's,
Right.
we don't ever wanna be one of those
Right,
people, but I'm just saying it's
Yeah.
a real
Yeah.
problem
Oh, yeah.
out there for a lot
And
of districts.
the state does not like to be in that position, by the way, even though they've done that for individual districts. But in this case, that's why I think there'll be some solutions coming from Olympia because they don't have the bandwidth to continue to do that for so many districts. Usually it's an individual, we can do this for a couple districts, but once it gets beyond that, there's well, we need to pump more money back into the districts because we can't handle this kind of oversight for each of the districts. So we'll continue to work. Again, I think globally, we're not alone, which is definitely to our advantage because otherwise, Tukwila is kind of a smaller voice down in Olympia. But when we have partners around us who are facing the same thing, we get to join in that chorus. That what would be beneficial for us is probably beneficial for everybody else too.
So, and how do we, 10% inflation? That's not only affecting our costs, it's affecting every family that lives in the city.
Absolutely.
And so how do we, and then when we look at our salaries compared to most of the salaries that people in Tukwila make, not working for the school district. How do we recognize what's happening in our local families' lives? That maybe is a total disconnect
Mhm.
with these big dollars that we're talking about, that, yeah, we have to
Right.
stretch them.
Yeah.
But it really, it's kind of out of touch.
Yeah,
Which I think is there's been language, I think we can use $300, that's just $300, but that is such a privileged way of thinking. And I know it's easy because you're looking at multi-million-dollar budgets, but and this is not, you didn't say that. I'm just saying, it came up, right? And so I think it's important for us.
Yeah.
Also to be really mindful of how we're talking about even really seemingly small amounts of money, because I think.
A 1% fund balance, how many of our families would like to have 1% left at the end of the year?
right.
You know?
Well, and quite honestly, the smaller your budget, the more real the numbers are, quite honestly. People can relate to them more.
Sure.
Being in a bigger district with over $1 billion budget, when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, most people can't relate to that. That's not something they have experience with. But when you're talking about thousands of dollars, that is something a lot of people have a personal relationship with, that many commas or few commas, right? If there's just one comma or no comma, people relate to that. It's yeah, I could almost see that in my budget. When you're talking about something with 2 or 3 commas after it, most people are I don't even know what that comma really looks like. It's never impacted me like that. So it is an important point, which to some of this conversation is when we have the conversations with people, it's got to be in a way in which it relates and can feel connected to that. So it's not so disconnected to this. It needs to be big picture enough without getting down in the weeds while still recognizing that even the small amounts all matter.
Yeah, I mean, they do understand that
Sure.
it needs to keep the power on. or have
Yes, Right.
food on the table for the kids or
Right.
whatever they get that.
But at the same time, we also, the way the system is that we need to be competitive salaries. I mean, it's written into our CPA and it just,
Right.
and if we didn't do that. I mean, we heard from parents, they want great teachers. You're not gonna get great teachers if we're
Yeah.
paying way below what the competitive salary is. And so that's just the reality of the system.
And we're there, which is.
Yep.
Which is where we are.
Thank you for that, and then I want to ask you about next steps, because when you work at charter school, you don't necessarily pay a whole lot.
Correct.
But because of the impact that you have, you're willing to go and work in a district where you know you're gonna have an impact on students. So I don't know, so I just want to say that. And then I want to ask about next steps. Did I hear about program evaluation and then creating phases of our work? Is that where we want to start? And then coming up with a one voice just coming up with a one voice statement that when people begin to ask. Is that where we are?
Yes.
I think so.
I think the program evaluation, program assessment, that can be a part of the phase process.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And that, it should be ongoing all the time.
Well, oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, when you say program evaluation, that's a really high level term. What do you exactly?
I think it came up earlier, just like what programs are like, what impact are the programs that we're doing having?
Oh,
what
that,
programs-
oh,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
yeah. From a community perspective, I
Yeah,
think,
yeah.
not.
I wonder too, with Dr. Virgin, to bring them to that, it's some questions we want to answer. What information do we want to gather? How do you want to gather our information? And then what baseline information do we need to share about how things happen?
Thinking about creating a flywheel in the phases, and in the flywheel, you know, the very first question is. For our community partners, you know, just different phases of the work. We'll start with a big bucket and then we'll build out what needs to happen in that bucket. Then we'll have another big bucket and we'll build out what needs to happen in that bucket. And we can work together to make that happen.
I love the idea of having some questions kind of within each of those, because what that could help us too is like, as we're, you know, just individual board members engaging with community members, if there's like questions within each phase that we're really trying to gather, we can then be on, God, I need to stop using that. I don't know why that keeps coming up. Jeez, that's something I say normally. Weird. So that we can have the information that we need to say, oh, this is exactly what we're trying to get answered right now. What do you think about this? And then we can capture that and
Yeah.
send it, you know, I think that could be really,
Yes.
really useful.
So we will
We
need
can-
a task force.
So we can work on that, and then what we'll do is also develop when we come together again and talk about our next budget thing, and then we can bring those things back. So we'll continue to work on that in the time.
So then. we can move on to our priorities.
Yes, we can. It is 10:42. Can we take a super quick, like a 3-minute bio break?
It takes Jack.
Okay, folks, you are welcome to stay for the board budget or the board priority discussion. You are also welcome to get on out of here. So either way, I know you want to get on out of here. You're good. So we are gonna take a quick 3-minute recess. We'll come back at 10:45. Thank you so much for being here if you are choosing.
So what is the deal with that?
The clock runs on
Oh,
bad.
yeah.
It's an analog battery clock, so.
Should we get some?
That's power.
I mean, it's right now.
Well, it probably kind of rattle. That's one thing.
There's supposed to be. Big steps.
That's not.
It's okay, we're not looking at. We are at.
Your pause, right?
Don't worry, you're fine. It's only It's all okay, it's okay, don't judge me. Oh, as I said, okay.
And I didn't know if you're wearing.
Oh.
Are we adjourning?
Just pause. You don't have to stay for this if you don't want to, Ms. Jones.
So what's the next piece?
The board priority sheet.
Is that something that we need to be here for?
You are fine.
You can stay or you can go.
Okay,
Teaching and learning will learn about those at our meeting, so you're free to go.
okay, thank you, Dr. Borsche. Thank you, team. Thank you for the conversation.
Welcome.
Meanwhile, see after cup later, flip basketball.
No, because you double lose.
I know.
I don't want to learn two double losses.
No, man.
Thank you for letting me, I don't have to school that to do, that's for the fifth graders that elementary school.
Oh, it's like that was a collective effort, I can't take full credit for that. That's a
Well,
collective
they were,
effort.
they have been so well received. Oh, my
Oh,
God.
yeah, the kids are loving the intramural activity.
What was wrong with this role in that?
Oh, she just happened, funny.
Wow, such a collective effort. Cool.
The issue with the. yes,
Does this
the-
mean I don't have to like
is
gather
so
questions
many
anymore?
applicants, right, like, are not- has to do with-
Yeah, hopefully people put it in there.
No kids.
In normal, it has gone up, the number of private schools.
I think that's what we need to do.
New private schools.
And building, you know, it's really.
You know, the other interesting thing, if you look at this, is it goes up.
So they might just all overlap each other.
But then it drops in high school. 6,000 to 53, 54 to 52, 51 to 42. So like people come back to public school when they were in high school, they go to private schools when they.
Well.
Or shipping them.
Include a charter?
Too.
No, because charter school.
Or cohort funded, okay.
Yes.
State.
But there aren't, I think there's 12.
You know, I mean, that's so interesting.
Yeah, but when I was like, oh, it did go up, but I thought, oh, yeah, like, look at. 2021, they're close to 2022. Yeah.
They're like,
Well, again, people like, oh, this is great. I try to go back to a public. Or I don't think they're now the next, so it's just kind of like where it's.
it's like this, starting, running, yeah, or going to community college or.
Could be. I mean, that's
Basically.
part of the state analysis. I've been figuring this right now.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it's
Really interesting.
It is.
As the sport, you know, season ends, we may get others, but then that messes up the schedule. And so anyway, it just needs to be a little thought. It's like a
Deb,
schedule problem.
curious, you were there.
Yeah.
Good, Jen.
Yeah.
I feel.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Yes,
Just
I will
curious.
look into that.
Did you want to say anything? We're gonna get started in a second. Did you want to share anything about the stuff, or do you want Director Larson or?
We can both pitch in,
Great.
but I don't have the ability to screen share, so
Okay.
that'd be great. Thank you.
We're not just
Share
that thing,
folders.
so I don't know how.
Oh, yeah.
You could
Beneficial.
just share it on the Zoom.
Send it out in an email, a link to it. Yeah.
All right. Wait just another minute there. Dr. Borsche to come back. While we're waiting on Dr. Borsche, you all should have gotten 2 emails. One was yesterday where Deb was sharing the Google Drive folder with everyone that we're going to be looking at. And then the other one actually just came through this morning at 8:30, which kind of outlines some of the components that are in that folder. So I'll screen share to at least even though.
We're looking at board priorities, is that what you said?
So the Google Drive, so go ahead and just click on the Google Drive itself, and there'll be a few different, I think we're gonna talk through all of it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because we've got a new process for just a few different things.
Okay.
Okay, so for this combo, we're really gonna start with looking at kind of the revamp of the board priorities document. That Director Larson and Ms. Core spent some time doing, and then we've got a few just different updated processes to really just kind of make sure that we are all in alignment from the board to the cabinet, in, you know, just trying to make some of our process a little bit more efficient and transparent. So with that, I don't know who might want to start, whether it's Director Larson or Ms. Core, but I'd love for you to kind of take it away.
You want to start with the priorities?
Sure.
The sheet.
Yep. So that would be the actual Google sheet, the BOD priorities.
Right.
Director Morse, do you need any help finding it? Okay.
I'm really starting, okay, got it.
Are you gonna display it on the?
Well, I don't know how
So
to,
you have to,
I think you have to-
it's in your, so.
You have to plug the presentation thing into your
And then
computer.
this
Oh.
over here.
Yeah, because we don't have that.
oh, so I gotta move, got it, okay, let me do that.
And the cord is marked with presentation, so it's easy.
No laughing here.
Okay, so, when I started, there was just a whole bunch of lists of stuff that had been created, I guess, over the years that, or maybe not years, but
Not years.
a few months, of things that have came up at board meetings about, you know, I would like to see this, I would like to see that, whatever. And so it's just a big list of stuff. And so the question was to try and have some organization to it, organize it a little bit with the ultimate goal of trying to get into the name of the document is priorities. So, I mean, there's more things on this list than we could possibly do in, you know, any kind of time frame. So the ultimate goal is to try and get to some priority thing, but before we get into priorities, I felt like we needed to kind of organize, because it was a huge, long list of just paid, you know, stuff. And so what I came up with here was trying to organize it along these different areas. The first being fiscal, which is, you know, the budget stuff, primarily what, you know, our CFO's kind of her area. And then a whole area of academics, which is whole bunch of stuff there. And then a whole area of social emotional learning and mental health. And then the other area I had here with is what I call data stories actions, which I think my observation is that as we, you know, discussed, we get a lot of presentations, for example, on data. Okay, data. Okay, here's the data. Now what? And then and then we hear stories, and then how do we connect all that, you know, it's data and stories, and then result in some action. And so I don't think we have the reason I put this one there is because I think we need to have a kind of a session, work session or whatever, on how do we do all that stuff. I mean, we've got student growth we're talking about, the different data, different schools presenting different formats, and then we have our CE data, you know, all this survey, which is a massive amount of stuff. How do we, and then, you know, the parent advisory committee, how do we think about organizing? And I guess, Dr. Borchett, you started to kind of think about that a little bit with your diagram, or, yeah, and so that's maybe, there's some more detail. So each one of these areas, the other thing I kind of was trying to do with this was to get a little more systemic thinking going, because what we get these siloed presentations, and we don't really have, how does this all fit into the big picture? And so if we have some kind of general area okay, we're gonna think about academics today, and not just, what's the, elementary math curriculum or something. Okay, so well, okay, but how does that fit in? How we vertically align that up and down we've done that in the past. It's very siloed, so we don't think about, okay, is this the right curriculum that's going to fit so that the students are going to be well prepared when they get to middle school, and they're well prepared for algebra when they get to high school, all those kinds of things. And so that's why I was trying to kind of, when we get these these could be work sessions, they could be weekend sessions, they could be, reports, but try and get some more systemic thinking about it. I mean, I know you're already that's the way you're thinking anyway. So, so I think we need to do a little work about how do we, get some agreement on exactly how we're going to look at student growth and so forth. And then there's the other category there is kind of this catch-all of board retreats. I mean, we typically have done those, when we're kind of bringing in new members, and there's the onboarding handbook project, I guess, we've got going, and, doing the annual calendar. So there's a whole kind of administrative stuff associated with boards there. And then there's a big long list of reports, which that's going to need some more work, because so Debbie went through and like pulled out all the policies that have reporting requirements. And we haven't really delved into all of those yet to see somebody, and this is another probably task force, and I can help do this, but I mean, there's one in there, what about, I think 24-hour, let's see,
We can start with staff vacations, Dave. If you click on that, Carly, where it's 5411 and click on the link there. And then hit reports, presentations, click that.
And before we do all that, can you just tell us, you said they due to board, race and equity, HR.
Okay, the top, yeah.
Can you just orient
Yeah,
us to this?
sure, yeah. So the other thing across the top, the date due to board, that's still obviously still working on. We're trying to get for some of these, some idea of, are these annual reports do we want to do this in what month and all that? That's obviously still, most of it's empty. So that we need some, some work on that. The idea between the race and equity, HR, strategic plan, these are areas that they kind of cross everything. So I think I'm not sure, I know Debbie was trying to think about putting X's where the particular area is relevant to whatever, the first one is budget. So obviously, I mean, the thing about race and equity in the toolkit is it kind of applies to everything pretty much. I mean, some things will be it'll be a greater emphasis than others. And I think this is an attempt to kind of say, if there's an X there, we really want to make sure that, the race and equity toolkit has been applied to whatever this area is. And of course, HR is another one of those things that's kind of potentially across everything. So again, if there's an X there, attempt to say, okay, this has some HR implications that we really want to look at. And then what happened to it? Oh, somebody, I think you hit something. You have edit capability.
Oh.
Undo.
It's good a few times. It's good, undo.
Strategic plan, that's another one that kind of, there's stuff in there that crosses everything. So that was kind of the attempt. I don't know, I have to probably think about that a little bit. And then the meeting type was, okay, what are we thinking about this as a, I mean, we could do it. You know, as just a report in the agenda item of a regular meeting, we could do it as a work study, we could do it as a weekend thing,
So WS, is that work session or weekend session?
Work
I think-
session.
session.
Okay, so then my question.
Debbie's gonna put in all those abbreviations at the top, so they know what they're.
Yes.
My question, as we continue our journey as an anti-racist district, race and equity should be in everything that we present. So to have a separate column means that we only look at it when we speak to that topic.
That's what Edna was trying to do. It's pretty cool.
But if it's in our presentation template, then we should be speaking to that all the time.
Yes.
Versus,
Yes.
we only speak about it when we're talking about our budget. Or priorities,
It's really.
curriculum. That's the way I would come to this sheet and look at it. Versus
Yeah,
it being,
It needs, there's a lot, it hasn't been filled in completely, there's a lot more X's, whether it's, I don't know, is it in every single one of them?
So I think what Dr. Borges is saying is it shouldn't be a column, it should already be
Should
inclusive
be.
of the.
Well, yeah, and so this is a kind of a way, I guess, of a reminder to say, yeah, it is actually everywhere.
it's a reminder to those of us presenting, or is it a reminder to the board?
Both.
Got it.
All of them should probably, all three of those columns should probably be in everything.
I don't know whether HR, like board retreat, new members, does that have an HR component?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think it's necessarily everywhere, but it's a lot of, yeah, and the X's could be filled in. Probably pretty much everywhere.
So has there been, just as a question. So for those columns, I mean, ideally, this is supposed to be a tool to be helpful to the board in tracking some of these pieces. So that would be, I guess, the feedback part that I'd want to know as a board, like, what makes sense on the columns piece? I mean, to Dr. Borche's point, we're trying to integrate race and equity into everything that we do.
Mhm.
So it's not seen as its own column, which is why, we've been trying to hire for the positions that kind of infuse that into all aspects of teaching and learning and professional development. So it's not, doesn't feel like just one person's job. So that's part of that, right? To infuse that. But I think for the tracking sheet, like if and I appreciate the strategic plan, because that's one of the things we've talked about is that the strategic plan may be having an emphasis on some areas, but there's lots of other stuff that's happening that may not be kind of spotlighted for that year or for these years. But there are some other reports that are annual that happen anyway.
Mhm.
Hopefully they would still be connected to the aspects of the strategic plan that we have, but they may not show up in the strategic plan as just a specific call out, because that's the whole point, like prioritizing certain areas of that. But we know these other aspects are happening, especially with a lot of those data reports. So I guess that's my part is, as a board, I just want to make sure that there's something that you will agree on to the columns, like this is how we want to categorize these things so we can keep track of them. The sheet is awesome because there is an ever-growing list of that. And I agree with being able to say, these are the points. So if we're making a presentation or preparing something, we want to make sure we're highlighting these specific areas. So
Yeah,
that's-
the everything if there's a better way to do that, I mean, if we just want to assume that. Everything's gonna take all of those three into account.
But then, I think going back to this, conversation that race and equity is not just when I'm at Tukwila, it's in our daily walks, so
Right.
to have to call it out suggests to me, and it's just to me, that we're gonna call it out in these particular buckets and not in everything that we do. And as a part of our walk, as a part of our journey, it's in everything that we do, not just in particular buckets. And that's just me.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so the question is, how do you wanna, I think we all need reminders sometimes that it is, I mean, as we're going down that path, that it is in fact in everything we do. Because I'm not convinced that it is at this point in time.
But
So the question is,
that
pardon me?
could be in a statement that it's.
Yeah,
Senate could be as included in.
sure, we could do that.
An idea or thought. So I agree with kind of conversation that's happening right now on this, it should be a thing that we are living and breathing as best as we can, right? What I wonder is, again, this is intended to really keep the board focused. I think particularly as like, I'm reflecting a little bit back on the, first training we did with, PSCSD, the end of last year, with Dr. Rogers and Canas, around one of the last things they said is like, what is our responsibility, particularly as a white board, to be asking, like, decentering whiteness? And so I think for me, maybe instead of is this a race and equity thing? Because again, it should be living or breathing. Maybe it's instead like, what is our centering question? Like, what is the board going to ask ourselves around this topic to make sure that we are centering race and equity? So that it becomes a more natural thing. Because I think for some of us, we're all in different places, right? And I think too, I might not be as natural to think about what is, I don't know, so like basically like, what can we be asking ourselves as it relates to each item to try and be decentering whiteness?
And is that,
Does that make sense?
is that a question, or is that something that you all are working on with Houston ESD, where as a white board, these are the questions that we will ask ourselves to be reminded, so that when presentations are being done, we can listen for it.
Yes.
Because when you go into the essential elements in a presentation, when you click that link, when you go down to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 arrow, it says race and equity tool.
Yeah.
So it will be in our presentation, there will be a spot in the presentation that will call it out. And then to have a column that, I don't know, that's just me.
So it's like, again, I think, yes, I think you put, yes, like, if this is more for us, it's what do I need to make sure that I'm asking myself to even be coming at the presentations you're providing with the right ones, right? And then making sure that we're holding each other accountable, and also that the presentations that are coming to us, we're making sure that we're asking the questions that we need to ask. And so maybe this would be actually an interesting thing to bring to.
March what?
Yeah, to March.
I was just thinking the same thing.
We really, maybe it's a question, maybe the question's different depending on the thing. Maybe there's one consistent question that we really need to be focusing in on, but maybe that's more of from the board's perspective, what is our race and equity lens that we need to have on this thing to ensure that we're doing our part.
As a tool for the board, I mean,
Yeah.
so I'm thinking about, our meeting yesterday and then our debrief with Puget Sound ESD folks and this March 11th piece. Because from what I know about what they are, they'll be covering the things that we covered just recently, which is some book review and some of the areas that are really good and would feed into this. And if they can do the kind of 2-on-1 conversations heading into that, I think that could make for, we could have this and the essential elements of a presentation. So that they can reflect back and they can hear, look, these are the tools we're trying to put in place to help us as a board. How are we thinking about this? Are we thinking about this in the right way? Are there other ways in which we can incorporate either practices and reflections for ourselves as a board? Again, because I think this is a tool to help the board and organizing, staying focused, all those things. But I think your thought about it being as a board, like, how are we using this tool to bring it to ourselves as staff? We obviously want to support that the best way that we can. But ultimately, this is a tool for you all.
It's like, how do we put something in place where we have something to check ourselves?
Yes.
And then y'all have something we all can check us, right? Around those things as well. So yeah, I mean, I think just to reiterate that again, Dr. Brescia too, like, these tools, while they will, of course, probably make y'all's job a lot easier, right? And what we're asking for in certain things, in that way, like, these are really designed to make sure that, like, we collectively are doing the things that we need to do and asking ourselves to make. So yeah, maybe that, I think it's a great.
So I find it, to get rid of that column, as long as it's incorporated in the, essentials of board presentation, that's fine.
Yeah.
Did this document also come out of our concern about follow-up on things that were? Okay, so.
Yes.
Yes,
Thank you. So, how do we? Okay, I don't see the Thorndike mascot on here. I don't see the SRO on here. I don't see some of the things that we sought follow-up on.
right, Jan, and they will be added. I haven't gotten there yet.
Oh, so this-
Those will be added.
so this was not complete from the old document, or this?
It is 90% complete. I've done the board work sessions and all of the reports, and I've started adding the outstanding items, which is still kind of messy, but they will be added in here.
And will they be in a separate outstanding items column so that we can see, because, I look at budget, a budget is ongoing all the time, everywhere, whatever. And a lot of these are just stuff that we need to be paying attention to all the time and aren't necessarily targeted to go back to.
Right, so they will be in the same column where you see these categories of fiscal, academics, et cetera. Carly, if you scroll down to the bottom. So this is the part, you'll see some of these down here with the book studies and the lap state report. Like, okay, the lap state report is supposed to be done annually. There's no information on that. The Thorndike mascot will also go down here where, the roadmap project is, the impact, all of those types of things. And it'll probably have a link to it, which will take you to this reports presentation notes page that will give you additional information as to what is needed. And it's up to you guys, if you'd like to see, like, I want to hear more about the Thorndike mascot, to put in, I would like to see this at such and such meeting, an update, blah, 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 so that we as a staff and cabinet and Dr. Herndon can say, okay, let's put this in the agenda, let's get that going with some notice. So it doesn't feel last minute.
Yeah, I mean, I really need those things set aside, set apart to say that we've asked for follow-up on these things.
Okay, so you want like where it says book study, you want something down below that says follow-up items.
I'm only one voice, but we asked for program review today. I can see that would go there, the mascot, the SROs, the stuff that is ongoing that we need updating on, that is really separate from the rest of, it's a minute little piece that.
So one of the things that I just thought of, so I think in part, from a holistic perspective, one of the things that we're trying to do is also like think about how we move away from this like constant state of preparing for board meetings, right? So the cabinet, from what I understand, it's like in this revolving door, right? And so then some of these other, because some of the follow-up that we're asking for is being put on another agenda item for another meeting. So I almost wonder, maybe we add two columns, one that says more information requested on, and then like follow-up type, where the follow-up could be in the memo, right? Or if we really need more, if we, like, if the item, like I'll take the roadmap project as an example. That's one that we've talked about wanting to like have some more, some conversation around. Maybe then that is marked as an in-person or in a meeting follow-up. So then maybe it will relieve some pressure if there isn't an item we can follow up on, but they can just send us a memo, or they can just send it, it can be between the meetings work. And then I also think the other big piece of this is really trying to think about, again, as this titled, how we prioritize these things, because again, I also want to make sure that like, we're not continuing to compound what we say are priorities on, the team. And so, maybe it's also, maybe we could color code it, a low priority might be a yellow, whereas a high priority is like a green. We need this, like, we really need this because we believe it's gonna be, the best interest of the district to get this information. I don't know.
But some of this is already on our agenda. It's already slated into the calendar,
Mhm.
right?
Yes,
Some of
And
it.
I thought this document that we we were developing was those things that were outside of the calendar.
I think the attempt was to
Do
just
both.
be both,
Yeah.
because they want,
Yeah.
they want one place, instead of having multiple places to go for, what does the board want?
Well, then
deleted everything. Yeah, exactly. And also hopefully like those things that are continuously, probably things that are coming up should then maybe be built into the calendar, right? So this can give us a good understanding of like, what is the board asking for from quarter to quarter that we could then just build in as an ongoing agenda item versus just as long as they're outstanding items.
But sometimes they are just one time.
Sure.
Sometimes.
So for me, when I heard the term board priorities, I was looking for a list of board priorities. And I just want to make sure I'm clear. So there are 44 items, priority, not to include the reports. Am I following, am I tracking right there? We have 44 priorities.
No, so I think that's what we need to also figure out, like, how are we, so this is a comprehensive list of everything that really the board's thinking about,
Reports,
right?
reports.
Reports are just.
Topic, yeah.
Right, so just, topics, whatever, and so I think in part, this is. And some of this is discussion, also is gonna be ongoing discussion, like, how do we prioritize within this long list, right? Because we know that there are a million things that y'all are all constantly thinking about. And how do we ensure that our priorities are all aligning so that if there's, and maybe there's like literally 2 priorities out of these 44. And like, I know I think based on our conversation this morning, our budget is a high priority, okay, helping us get to a place where we can see ourselves in a financially sustainable position in the next 5 years, like that, to me, feels like one of the highest priorities, right? So, it is both an extensive list of all the things and figuring out how in it. Yeah, within it, how we can prioritize, which I think is also challenging because the priorities change and shift based on what's happening right at the time. But I also think, I've been thinking about like, that probably shouldn't be the way that the board operates necessarily. The board should have a few priorities and y'all priorities shift, right? I don't know.
So to your point, if we have a desired outcome, these priorities are gonna help us get to that outcome. So would they shift? Because we build our trajectory built on, this is what the outcome needs to be. So we wouldn't shift.
I think when I think about priorities shifting, what I mean is like.
The work might shift, but the priorities.
The work, yeah, I think it's more the work, and so I guess from like an implementation standpoint, a priority of like where we're spending maybe more time and energy and budget, right? That may shift based on what is happening, that will, yes, will ultimately help get us to our income, desired outcome.
Or if there were, if there's a new dynamic of something.
Yeah.
Like there's
Yeah,
a dramatic shift, something that happens within the community, something that happens at the state level. That then trickles down to say, I think we need to shift the priority here. Not all of them.
So let's make this business about the SRO. We went into COVID, we still have this notion of student safety. The work changes because the students are now at home doing remote learning. So the work changes, student safety is still a priority, but the work changes. But the priority is still the same in terms of student safety, but the work changes. Does that make sense?
yes, yes. Thank you for asking that way. I mean, I think I may not be using the right language around that too, but yeah.
So what does it add for us if we have you know, number 28, 29, and 30, math, science, and CTE. Are we asking for a report on those? Are we just making sure that we know that those are a part of our program? I don't know exactly why that's even on there.
So if you're asking that question, imagine how I would feel.
Yeah, this was the first, we had these 5 pages of stuff. And this was just an attempt to take all that and categorize it.
Yeah.
And then, you know, go to this
So-
next level of depth about, okay, what are we talking about in each one of these things?
So math, science and CTE came about because you guys were looking at the board tracking sheet and saying, well, we have a department update here, and we have an update on this one. Why don't we have something on math? Why don't we have something on CTE? So that's where those came about.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Deb. I'm just trying to figure
Oh, it's
out.
okay.
And yeah, it is helpful to know why we put them on there. Without that explanation, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
mean-
So it's still a work in progress. I'm still working on it.
Yeah,
I mean, for me, I would see CTE, I want to see things like, you know, what's the student enrollment, the fact that we have a continuous enrollment, and what are the categories of, it's more of a report about what's going on in that area.
but don't we already have that in our.
Yeah, but do we want to see that, you know, maybe get that report on an annual basis about what's going on in CTE? That's all.
So as I think about some of this, helping staff bridge, to me, this is trying to get from the board the information or knowledge you need to be able to make decisions when we get to whatever those are. Some of these are actual decision pieces, other these are pieces of information that help with that. As I see this, you know, I would look at this, we talk as staff, how do we take some of these pieces and group them into one so that we can hit them all? So it's not necessarily, you know, 100 different things.
Yeah.
As we look at math, science, CTE, we can highlight some of those aspects in whatever it may be in the SIP, in the district improvement plan and curriculum. Hopefully those things start to reveal themselves. And so, you know, it's like, this is the element that we're talking about. And hopefully as we do the presentation kind of template, those are the kinds of things that we have highlighting and help out.
Yeah, I think that's really effective, Leslie, because like, you know, I think what is useful about this, from my perspective as a board member, I can see where it's not helpful for you, but for me, someone that like doesn't even like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of the different pieces that could fit into a certain bucket. So I think this is helpful from that perspective to be like, okay, math, science, and CT, those are things that, you know, should be communicated or presented in some way at some point, right, within the context of probably some other report. But again, like this gives me an understanding of, okay, these are all the things that like I actually need to be thinking about every once in a while to make sure is coming to us in the right way, that it, or, you know, coming to us at some point.
So for example, you know, when I think of math, I know we're going through a math curriculum pilot. And so it informs when I see a budget come in, okay, is there, we've selected this new curriculum. Do we have, but I mean, this has come up before. Do we have the budget to do the appropriate training and implementation of it? You know, so that when I'm looking at budget, I know, okay, this is what's going on in math. You know, is there budget there to do what we want to do?
So would that be a one-time presentation? Because in my mind, I'm thinking.
Well, there's always something going on.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the year, when we do our district improvement plan.
Yeah.
That would be talked about, all of the subjects would be talked about in that,
Okay.
and then we would give updates.
As you
Sure.
see.
As, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's a really good, I mean, you brought up that point too, about how we can consolidate, think about consolidating these things. Yeah,
Just know that each of these reports take
They take-
a lot of time.
Right, which is what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to minimize, not the amount of time necessarily, but the amount of reports that you're having to do so that, you know, we can focus on quality over quantity, right? Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about a couple of things to just kind of. One, I think would be if we could get any helpful edits or notes from the board directors about this as a tool. 'Cause we
Yes.
thought, again, we want to help make that happen. I think as a staff and a cabinet, we can look at some of these things and think about how we can group these things as well. Hopefully to hit as many of the items on here so that it doesn't look like as long of a list. Again, I think using this and the board presentation sheet for the March 11th conversation also will be helpful, because then I think there's some other elements about how we're using tools to better reflect how we're integrating a lot of areas around race and equity will be helpful. Because then at least that gives, staff the opportunity to take a look at this, go through it, say, okay, I can see how we can combine some of these things. And then as a board, as you're seeing areas that you want to either add another column or place them under certain categories, that's fine too. And then hopefully we can get both of those things and kind of match them to get something that then works out well. And my guess is this will be an annual thing, because you'll have, when you have new members come on, like, definitely want to review that. Yeah.
So to me, the goal here is to mesh kind of what the board is looking for with the natural work that you guys are doing already.
Workflow. Yeah.
So that there isn't so much of, oh, I have to do this extra thing.
Right.
I mean, that's what I want to try to avoid whenever possible. So to the degree that we can mesh those two together, then to me, that's the goal there.
Yes.
So we're all operating on the same, same, as you say, outcome goals kind of thing.
So maybe if you guys went through and highlighted the ones that are already on the calendar.
Mm-hmm.
So
We can do
that,
that.
so that then we see what's left out.
Because I think some of it's just about sharing the work that you guys are doing.
Right.
So it's not, I mean, yeah, you may have to do a little PowerPoint or something, but it's not create some new task that we don't really, has no relevance to everything else you're doing. That's a disconnect for me. You need to
Yeah.
figure out, okay, what's going on in that?
Right.
How can we get on the same page?
Yes.
I also look at this, I think it's helpful for a lot of reasons, as we get that alignment, just going back to what we've talked about throughout this morning. I think it helps us messaging and interacting with community and students to explain a lot. Everything that we do can be really overwhelming. There's a lot that happens, and some people are like, I don't even know what's happening. Like, I'm focused on this, but there are so many other things happening. The more coordinated we can be with this, to be able to make that accessible for people so that they can also see the connections within the community, that's helpful for us too, whatever that may be. And hopefully it helps us boil it down to some snippets that are less about the technical language of the things that we do, which certainly we do, technical language is helpful for the practitioners because it speeds things up for us, but it doesn't necessarily make folks who are not in that easily digestible, because we just use it as shortcuts for us because we know how to speak that language. Every discipline kind of has that. And I think these connections to policies are great. So I think there's a lot of stuff in here, hopefully, that we can start to connect as staff to say, this is how I think we can group these things together.
Some of the policies in there are also to help keep us in line with, because these are board approved policies. And these ones listed have reports due that some I don't think we have ever done. For example, staff vacations, 5411. You're supposed to report to the board rollover vacation annually in the month with which the carryover occurs. Have we ever done that? If not, why is it in our policy?
Yeah, so there's like, so that
There's a
brings up
bunch of
like
those.
a, misalignment of like, which is. not
Right.
And.
And then there's other things that are, it has to be done by a certain date. So that would go back on the first page of this so that we could see we have to have this done by such and such time, which means we have to start working on this at this time.
Yeah.
Are these all reports to the board or are some of these reports to the state or whatever?
These are mostly reports to the board based on board approved policies.
Okay. thank you.
But we had other reports, obviously, that are state reports, typically those come to the board also. Like if we're
Right.
doing a state report, there's a high likelihood that it also has to come to the board for their approval.
Okay.
And then so we can list in there also. I think a helpful thing in there just for, and maybe we do it in this section, that's not necessarily on the whole sheet. But if there's a report due, yeah, you already have it there as required. But I wonder if we have something that's like also state, it identifies if it's a state or federal requirement. Because some of these could be up to the board's discretion about whether or not you want to continue to do them. Others, we don't have the discretion. Like,
Yeah.
we have to.
Frankly, there needs to be one or two of us, whatever, sit down with it and go through every one of these policies and
A
look
lot
at,
of policies.
does this make sense? If
Yeah.
not, let's do a policy revision,
Yeah.
get out of there, or, or
Yeah.
can we combine it, or, whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
there's just some grunt work that needs to
Some
be
of the
done.
other piece that people may not realize is that some of these policies, not the board, the auditor audits too,
Mhm.
right? So there's certain policies that, well, based on your policy, it's saying that, are you doing that?
Correct.
Or, hey, I'm looking at your policy, there was something that changed, you have not updated, please make sure to get it into your rotation, so. we have to be
And again,
cautious of that.
some of these policies are based on requirements, others are policies the board developed themselves, so.
Correct.
So I think that would be really helpful if we could add that column and then, yeah, Director Larson, just being, a policy person, like policy, and I'm happy to support that, as well. But yeah, maybe that's a project that we could kind of start looking at our internal policies and which ones.
I can tell you, it's a lot of work. When I was doing my superintendent internship, I did this for a district. It usually is between 600 and 700 policies to go through.
Mhm.
So it's a great internship project. It's hard for regular staff to find that kind of bandwidth, so I think we might have to look at some ways to have that increase the bandwidth to do that. Because it takes a lot of time to review every policy.
Mhm.
I think it's important to do it, but I think we can think of some ways hopefully to help speed that up, so it doesn't take, 2 years or something like that.
There's also reports at the bottom of this page that aren't policies, that are just like,
Oh,
not
yeah.
too far down.
Other reports, so they're.
Yeah,
daily.
yeah,
We have a list, again, that I think in the past, the board has said, we'd like a report about this.
correct.
So I think that's a good review of the reports, the annual reports that the board has asked for. Because that's sounds like completely board discretion.
Yeah, so if you highlight those differences also.
Yeah. I think that would be helpful.
So definitely over, just kind of to research back a little bit, some, I think, work to do on the structure of the sheet. So like maybe y'all can take it back, talk a little bit amongst y'all's team. We'll bring it to the March 11th meeting, to have some discussion around it as well. I do just want to make sure that, that what Director Bolerjack brought up earlier about being able to in some way track, maybe we get a report on something, we've got some follow-up items, how or where can we include that on this? One for our own tracking and also of course, for you all. Yeah, so some next steps on this.
I think for me, those ones, the SRO, the Thorndike mascots. That to me is, we could just put at the bottom of, it's a report basically about what's going on with those things, and then.
I've added it to the bottom of the sheet already.
Okay, you already have that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Oh, you said under follow-up, to me, it's another report. So I
Yeah,
would,
but I think for me, it's important to know that we've asked for it and we're waiting for. something.
Agreed,
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah, and that's fine, and so it'll be there and it'll have a date attached.
It doesn't have to be a
So-
report, it's a update.
Just an update.
Well, what's the
Yeah.
difference between an update and a report?
Reports at a board meeting versus I feel like an update could be in a memo.
Well, we could have, this could be under the meeting type thing, it could be memo update.
Yeah, yes.
I'm just trying to avoid creating enough more categories.
A lot more.
If we can fit it within the categories that are existing there and get the same result, because, yeah,
And this is also something that we can add to, I would hope.
Mhm.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes, yes.
It's still our work.
Yes, yes. I think one other thing that would be, you know, really mentioned the mascot, that's a good example, but what is probably just like a one-time thing or a one project or scope thing versus like something that's ongoing. You know, because I think another thing that could happen is if we list, as we saw with the previous document, it was just this large running list. How do we then really make sure we're identifying, oh, well, that was just for that one project that's over, or it's, you know, and that we don't really need to capture that anymore. Or maybe we have a completed, but maybe we have another tab where if it, once it's complete, we've got the information we feel like we need, we can move it over there. We don't have to worry about it ever again.
yeah, because that's what we had on the previous list. There was
It
a
was,
bunch of things that were already done.
yeah,
And so either, yeah, move it or just delete it, whichever when it's done. So not only could you add things, but you take things away when they're done.
It's helpful, thank you.
So yeah, kind of what's the next?
So, for me, I don't know about you, for me, I would love the board input. I'll bring this up for staff at our next cabinet meeting next week. I'm gonna project, you know, I need some think time from them to be able to get together and talk about that. It's the 11th right now. Maybe if we could get feedback from board, any edits by the end of next week, then we can start to consolidate that for the week after. Because
Do
I
you want
can
the
take-
edits on here or the edits sent, the suggested edits sent?
probably the suggested edit sent, that way, as we're building it, Ms. Core can kind of be
Yeah.
the one that's building it, I mean, assuming that's okay with you, Deb.
Yep.
The one that's actually like building the structure of it, and then
Correct.
once the structure of it is done, then we'll all have edit access.
So Debbie's still, she said she's still in the process of adding some stuff.
Yep.
Going on. We agreed that we're gonna get rid of the, oh, it's already gone, okay. The race equity is gone, column is gone. Staff is gonna review do you want, Leanne or Debbie to go through these policy things?
If there's the link to the policy and there's a data
Or,
piece that goes with it, I mean, we can take a look at that. If you and Ms. Core want to talk about some of those items for us, we'll take an initial glance at it to say,
at the policy ones,
yeah,
okay,
to see if it fits in with something else, and if something's not kind of lining up with something else, we'll figure out a way to indicate that this seems like a standalone, or we're missing the connection, maybe you're seeing a connection that we're not.
and when you say, board edits sent to. When you say edits, do you mean things added or?
Any feedback about column organization structure of the document itself?
So our goal here is to decrease the amount of extra work that we're asking for the admin.
Yes, that's a big piece of it, yes.
Yes.
To keep us on track just with our own things, because we can't all hold it all in our head at one time.
And get us the information.
Yeah, get us the information we need and just ultimately just be more efficient collectively. With all of our time.
Carly, can you go back to that main folder? So we can
Yes.
talk about the board question. Yeah, that one, the board questions. I know we're getting short on time. So this was an email, I think Carly had it up earlier, that I sent out. And everybody has editor access rights to it at the time being. So if you have questions about the presentations, normally you would type them up, email them to the board president, who would organize them, and then email them to Flip, who would then get the email and send it out to staff. And we have to have them back to you by 4 p.m. Monday or 4:30 Monday. It takes a lot. So if you guys could start putting them in there, then you can see, oh, that question's already been asked. It saves Carly time, us time, everybody time.
Bless you.
Yeah. And in the past, the request had been, if you have questions, to have them in by Sunday, 5 o'clock had been kind of the timeline we've been looking at, because then that way staff can see it. They can start working on some of the initial questions, but I can tell you, like Monday, most of the day, Monday is preparing responses to the questions.
Correct.
Eats up a lot of that time, but obviously we want to make sure you have time over the weekend to read the items, because they go out to the board and then you can formulate your questions based on that. But that's been kind of our piece. So if we know that all the questions will be in there by Sunday, then staff can go in there, access this, and then they can see what the questions are gonna be.
Deb, could you put that at the top to remind us of when we need to get it in? Because I was looking at this 4 o'clock on Monday saying, oh, we've got it.
Okay, so I can put in there BOD, all questions need to be in this document by what time is acceptable?
Yeah.
Sunday,
5 o'clock.
5 o'clock Sunday.
5 o'clock Sunday.
And I gotta say to that, I will do my best.
Yeah, my question would be in by 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Why,
Well, never mind, I see, it'll be in by Sunday.
Oh,
why couldn't it be 7 o'clock on Monday morning?
Because when do you, should be working on Sundays anyway.
When do you touch this, Deb?
Pardon?
When do you touch this? To send it
Uh, as soon as I get it, it's anywhere between, I've seen emails from Flip at like midnight. Now, of course, I'm not going to touch that then because I'm asleep, but usually first thing in the morning. And there are already answers. I'm already have emails with answers.
Okay.
A lot of that is me, honestly. I've been sending it at like 10 PM on Sunday night, and then usually
I
always
send it.
automatically get a
I'll send it right away. Yeah.
One thing too about the question, so this will be helpful, I think, for everyone, if you all get the questions a little bit earlier, because maybe you can try to fit it in a problem. But another thing too, that like if it's a presentation, I'm okay with the question literally being answered at the board meeting at the presentation. So if like, if like it's like the ELL, the visual language update, I think that's a presentation, not a questions only. So like if there's a question around that, I'm okay with you not putting, like answering the question here and just bringing the answer to the presentation. I don't know if that would save time, if that would not save time, I don't know, but, cause then,
Sometimes we get the same question again, and again, and so we can just go back to this document
Mhm.
and pull that same.
Yeah, that's then been my kind of the frustrations, because it's gonna come up again with the ready. I keep asking for the same thing. And I tried to sit down with people, I mean, we need to somehow resolve that, so I don't keep asking for the same thing. Okay, that's not productive for me, it's not productive for you guys, it's not,
So Dave, this is where you could put that in that board priorities. iReady data must have.
Well, that's why I have the whole discussion of the data stories, so forth, we need to agree, we're still a ways away, I think, from.
Maybe that needs to be a session, not a Saturday session.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
so we just sit
Yeah.
down and talk about
Yeah,
the way it's the preferred method of how it needs to look.
To your point, though, when we met about the kids who were 2 or more in 300 behind, I do know that Shelby has been working with iWriting, so we can create them as an individual group, so we can follow some kids.
yeah,
We could follow the kids like in June,
Yeah.
follow like that for a whole year, and it's
Okay.
taken her longer than she was hoping with iWriting to be able to do that from the tech end of pieces.
yeah, so that's kind of,
The other thing we discussed as the close
okay,
is
okay,
because the tech part we don't have.
And that means you see how long the campus meeting in DC.
yeah,
It's almost more.
yeah, right,
And we still need to close that loop, but because it takes this long to get that, it may seem like we didn't hear you or we aren't giving it to you the right way, but it just takes that long. And it could be on other reports that just takes that long in order for us to close the loop.
So we would, that can be communicated to the board so that we know it's happening.
That's been happening better. I feel like in all the reports we've been getting recently, I've really seen that a lot
Yeah.
more, like, here's why we can't give you this information right now, and that's how you'll put me up. Or one thing you do want to think about the questions, I think if
same questions are being asked over and over. I think that raises two things for me, a question that we need to ask as a board and the question that y'all probably need to ask as a cabinet, right? So for us as a board, it's maybe there's a different way that I could ask this question if I'm not getting the answer that I need. And from y'all's perspective is if they keep asking the same question, it's probably 'cause they're not getting the answers that they need. So I'm not really answering the question. So I think again, it could be a little bit of both. It could be one or the other depending on the question. But I think if we all approached it with a little bit of that lens, I need to be more intentional about how I'm asking the question, asking it a different way instead of the same question 4 times. And I do that. And then same for y'all as well. Then maybe we can start to get a little bit closer to the right questions and answers that we really.
Yeah, ultimately, it just communicating through this is a kind of gross, high level way to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, we need to actually sit down and
Sure.
face to face,
Yeah.
and then you guys can just, if it's gonna take, longer to do it, just tell me that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that I don't have to ask it.
We're trying to work, no.
Yeah.
It takes that long sometimes to get.
Yeah, then just tell me, it'll be whenever, and then I can stop asking the same question, and I'll wait until that time.
Like
Yeah.
our student representative asked for the difference between our high cap and our avid, and so you'll see in our report that we have a presentation
Yeah,
that lists out how we're doing in avid
right.
and how our students are doing in high cap. That is also going to then speak to the notion of us saying we want to become an average school district. But looking at our data, what does it tell us? So.
Yeah, so those are,
Setting the tone for that, beginning there.
yeah, so I think those are good examples. So the document, I think, should be helpful.
Which is the other part of and this is a thing for me is, and we've talked about this quite a bit, is when data is presented, I really want to see analysis with it.
Yeah.
And that's basically on you guys. So like we have iReady this time again, it's just data. So then, so what?
Yeah. Okay.
And I understand that's gonna take long, I mean, it's one thing to produce the data. It's another thing for you guys to review it and then have some thoughts about what to do with it. And I'm more than willing to wait an extra time to hear that, analysis, because just straight data is kind of.
So then that means that when there's a data report, then the analysis will come behind that, not on the same day.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
all trying to beat the same
Sure.
timeline.
Yeah.
So then that analysis should come after.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is, I think it would be better to, rather than show us the data immediately when it's produced, I'll wait for,
Yeah.
a few months
Data
while you
with
guys do the
analysis.
analysis, and then
Yeah.
present it both together.
Yeah.
That's a more satisfying, presentation.
And I think that can be helpful going back to the tracking sheet, is just like, this is the report with the analysis, so that it gets that kind of time frame to say, okay, we've got the data at this date, it's gonna take us another 2 weeks or 3 weeks to do the analysis with it. So I think, just tying all those things together will be helpful. So,
I really appreciate this forum.
yeah, I think it's gonna be,
I know when I was the chair or the president, and I had to try to put everybody's different formats together.
yeah. So thank you for the work and the feedback on this, because it's helpful. It'll be helpful. I mean, again, we'll try it, put it into practice and see how it looks.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I just want to say a big thank you to Director Larson and Ms. Flor for putting the time. I know I met at least twice to really navigate this. Ms. Flor, I know that you put a lot of time into structuring these, so thank you so much. I think this will just help everybody's work. These other few things that are in this folder are, of course, the essential elements, the work presentations that we had spent some time talking about. I think, might be worth revisiting again in a few months here, just to make sure that they're all still feeling the same and as relevant as they need to be. And then the presentation template that folks are using.
Yeah, the other one that's gonna require some, I think, expanding based on what I've seen is applying the race and equity toolkit to presentations. So I'm always asking questions about, tell me about the disproportionalities, that's part of the race and equity toolkit. And then the other things that I think typically haven't been covered is, so the race and equity toolkit talks about going out to the affected parties and getting input from them. And I don't see that has happened much.
And it's because of the timeline, the turnaround.
Yeah,
that
okay.
We need to make sure that we get these reports.
Okay,
But we can make sure that that happens. We can make sure.
So can I ask one more question about this document? When I look at the agenda for Tuesday, there's stuff on the agenda that's not in the document. So if we have questions about vouchers or the action items, it's not.
So Jan, back to the email that Carly had up on her screen previously. It says if you do not see the agenda item listed for your question, comment, you can add it.
Okay. I know how to add a column.
I go through it and ask you.
You don't, you just have to right click and it'll say, added row above or below.
yeah, you're adding rows. And
Insert row above or below. There you go.
It's gonna be, vouchers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll insert one below.
this could get really interesting if two of us are in there at the same time, but
Well, I won't be there until like 10 or 11, so you're fine.
That's Carly and I might be in there.
Yeah, probably. All right, any other kind of big lingering things, definitely some more work to do, I did promise that we do. It's only 10 minutes.
Hey,
I should never say that, because I tried to like say that in trainings too, and then it just never.
I always say all the time.
Is it feeling okay? All right, well then we will move to adjourn at 11.
Thank you, everybody.
I just need a quick, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.